They say the rails remember everything. Every departure, every arrival, every soul that never made it home. Tonight, we're boarding a midnight express through 12 of America's most haunted train stations, where security guards work alone in the dark, and where some passengers have been waiting decades for their final departure. In Kansas City, a phantom conductor still calls all aboard for a train that crashed in 1952. In St. Louis, a woman in a wedding dress searches hotel corridors for luggage that holds terrible secrets. And deep beneath Washington, D.C., classified meetings continue in rooms that officially don't exist. These aren't just ghost stories. They're the desperate testimonies of night shift workers who witnessed something that shouldn't be possible. Security footage that shows empty platforms suddenly filled with travelers from another era. Temperature drops that turn breath to frost in heated buildings. And always, the sound of trains that no longer run. So dim the lights, check your doors, and keep your ticket ready. Because once you hear these stories, you might find yourself listening for that distant whistle in the dark, wondering if it's calling your name.
The fluorescent lights in Grand Central Terminal cast long shadows across the marble floors as the clock struck 2:47 a.m. on a bitter February night. Marcus Chen, a night janitor with 12 years of experience cleaning New York's most famous train station, pushed his cart through the lower-level concourse, the wheels squeaking in rhythm with his footsteps. The terminal was never truly empty, but at this hour, it came close. A few homeless individuals slept in corners despite security's best efforts, and the occasional late commuter stumbled through. But mostly, Marcus worked in the kind of silence that made every sound echo like a gunshot. The cleaning schedule called for him to work his way through the main concourse, then down to the dining concourse, and finally to the lower-level tracks. It was methodical work that he could do with his eyes closed, which sometimes felt like a blessing and sometimes like a curse. Tonight, as he mopped near track 61, the secret platform used by presidents and dignitaries, something felt different. The air seemed thicker, charged with an electricity that made the hair on his arms stand up. Marcus had heard the stories, of course. Every employee who worked the overnight shift had heard them. Tales of phantom trains that arrived at platforms that shouldn't exist, carrying passengers who had been dead for decades. He'd always dismissed them as urban legends, the kind of stories that grew in the dark corners of a building that never slept. But as he worked his way deeper into the terminal's bowels, past platforms and through maintenance corridors he'd traveled thousands of times, he began to notice things that didn't belong. The temperature dropped first. Marcus's breath began to fog, which was impossible. The terminal's heating system was industrial grade, designed to keep the massive space comfortable even in the depths of winter. Yet with each step he took toward the eastern wall of the lower level, his breath became more visible until it looked like he was walking through a freezer. The wheels of his cart began to resist, as if the floor itself was pushing back against his movement. Then came the sound. At first, Marcus thought it was the rumble of a late train pulling into one of the upper platforms, but the vibration was wrong. It came from below, from somewhere impossibly deep beneath the terminal's foundations. The rumble grew stronger, accompanied by what sounded like the hiss of steam and the screech of metal wheels against rails. But there were no tracks beneath the lower level. Marcus knew every inch of this place, every pipe and wire and structural beam. There was nothing below them but solid Manhattan bedrock and the subway system, and the subways didn't run steam trains. As the sound grew louder, Marcus noticed something else that made his blood run cold. Light was seeping through the eastern wall, not electric light, but the warm, flickering glow of oil lamps. The granite blocks that formed the terminal's foundation wall began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, and through the shimmer, Marcus could see the outline of an arched doorway that had never existed before. The rumbling reached a crescendo, and Marcus heard the unmistakable sound of a train pulling into a station. Brakes squealed, steam hissed, And somewhere beyond that impossible doorway, he could hear voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all talking at once in languages he couldn't identify. But beneath the foreign words, he caught fragments of English, phrases that chilled him to the bone. The crossing is tonight. They're waiting on the other side. All aboard the Midnight Express. Marcus dropped the handle of his cart and stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. The voices grew clearer as they approached the doorway, and he began to make out individual words. A woman's voice, speaking with an accent he couldn't place, said something about the final destination. A man laughed, but the sound was hollow, echoing as if it came from the bottom of a well. Children giggled, but their laughter had an edge to it, like breaking glass. The light from beyond the doorway grew brighter, and Marcus could see shadows moving within it. Human shapes, but wrong somehow, elongated and twisted as if they were being stretched by invisible hands. The shadows reached the threshold of the doorway, and Marcus caught a glimpse of what lay beyond. It was a platform, ornate and Victorian in design, with wrought iron benches and gas lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls covered in symbols he didn't recognize. A train waited at the platform, but it wasn't like any train Marcus had ever seen. The locomotive was massive, black as midnight and decorated with silver inlays that seemed to move in the flickering light. Steam poured from its stack, but the steam was the wrong color, too dark, almost purple in the gaslight. The passenger cars stretched back into darkness, their windows glowing with the same sickly light that emanated from the platform lamps. And on the platform itself, waiting to board, were the passengers. They wore clothes from different eras: Victorian dresses and modern business suits, military uniforms from wars long past, and casual clothes that looked like they belonged in a shopping mall. But their faces were all wrong. Some were too pale, their skin translucent enough to show dark veins beneath. Others had eyes that reflected light like an animal's, or mouths that opened too wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp. A few had no faces at all, just smooth expanses of skin where their features should have been. One of them, a woman in a 1950s traveling dress, turned and looked directly at Marcus. Her eyes were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire eye, like looking into deep water at night. She smiled, and Marcus saw that her teeth were silver, each one carved with tiny symbols that hurt to look at. She raised her hand and beckoned to him, and despite every instinct screaming at him to run, Marcus felt his feet begin to move toward the doorway. The woman's voice reached him across the impossible space, sweet and melodious, but with an undertone that made his teeth ache. "The train is departing soon," she said. "There's a seat reserved just for you. Such a long journey you've had, working these midnight hours, cleaning up after the living. Wouldn't you like to rest? To take a trip somewhere peaceful, somewhere you'll never have to work again?" Marcus tried to resist, but his legs continued to carry him forward. The other passengers on the platform had turned to watch him now, their various faces showing expressions of hunger and anticipation. A businessman in a three-piece suit that looked like it came from the 1920s opened his mouth, and Marcus saw that his tongue was black and forked like a snake's. A little girl in a school uniform from decades past giggled and waved, but her hand had too many fingers, and they were all the wrong length. The conductor appeared in the doorway of the nearest passenger car. He wore a uniform that seemed to shift and change as Marcus watched, sometimes blue, sometimes black, sometimes a deep red that reminded him of dried blood. The conductor's face was hidden in the shadow of his cap's brim, but Marcus could see his smile, white teeth in an expanse of darkness. "All aboard," the conductor called, and his voice echoed from every surface in the terminal. "Final call for the Midnight Express. Destination unknown. Departure immediate." Marcus was only a few steps from the doorway now, and he could feel the heat radiating from the impossible train platform. It wasn't the warm heat of a normal fire, but something else, something that made his skin crawl and his bones ache. The passengers were pressing closer to the doorway, their eager faces turned toward him like flowers following the sun. The woman in the traveling dress reached out her hand, and Marcus could see that her fingernails were long and black, curved like talons. That's when his carts will caught on an uneven section of floor behind him. The jarring motion broke whatever spell had been drawing him forward, and suddenly Marcus could think clearly again. He threw himself backward, away from the doorway and the reaching hands of the passengers. The woman in the traveling dress let out a shriek of frustration that echoed through both the real terminal and the phantom platform. The other passengers pressed forward, but they couldn't seem to cross the threshold of the doorway. Marcus scrambled to his feet and ran. Behind him, he heard the conductor's voice again, but now it was filled with rage instead of false kindness. "You cannot run forever," the voice boomed. "We know where you work, where you walk these halls night after night. The Midnight Express runs on schedule, and you will catch it eventually." The train's whistle blew, a sound like screaming metal that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Marcus didn't look back as he ran through the terminal's corridors, past the empty shops and darkened restaurants, up the ramps toward the main concourse. Behind him, the sound of the departing train grew fainter, but it didn't disappear entirely. Even when he reached the main level and saw the normal electric lights and familiar surroundings, he could still hear it somewhere in the distance, like thunder that wouldn't fade. Marcus never reported what he saw that night. Who would believe him? But he requested a transfer to the day shift, and he never worked past sunset in Grand Central Terminal again. Sometimes, when he passed the eastern wall of the lower level during his regular cleaning rounds, he would feel a chill and hear the faint sound of train wheels on tracks that didn't exist. And sometimes, late at night when he was trying to sleep in his apartment in Queens, he would hear a train whistle in the distance and wonder if the Midnight Express was still making its rounds, still collecting passengers for its journey to an unknown destination. The other night janitors who worked Marcus's old shift began reporting strange things. Doors that opened by themselves, cold spots that appeared without explanation, and the sound of footsteps in empty corridors. But none of them saw the doorway to the phantom platform. Perhaps it only appeared to those who were meant to see it, those who were being called to board the Midnight Express. Or perhaps Marcus had simply been in the right place at the wrong time, witnessing something that was never meant for living eyes. What Marcus never learned was that the platform he saw was part of Grand Central Terminal's original design, a secret level that was sealed off during construction in 1913 after 3 workers disappeared during the night shift. The official story was that they had been crushed in a tunnel collapse, but the truth was that they had simply vanished, leaving behind only their tools and the faint sound of a train whistle that echoed through the construction site for weeks afterward. Sarah Mitchell pulled her rental car into the empty parking lot of the Gettysburg Lincoln train station just as the last rays of October sunlight disappeared behind the Pennsylvania hills. As a paranormal investigator and historian, she had visited hundreds of allegedly haunted locations, but something about this place made her feel uneasy before she even stepped out of the car. The station, built in 1858, had served as both a transportation hub and a makeshift hospital during the Civil War. Thousands of wounded soldiers had passed through its doors, many of them never to see home again. The station building itself was modest compared to the grand terminals of major cities, but its red brick walls and simple architecture held a dignity that spoke to its historical importance. This was where President Lincoln had arrived on November 18, 1863, the day before he delivered the Gettysburg Address. But it was also where countless anonymous soldiers had departed for battles they wouldn't survive, and where the wounded and dying had been brought back from the bloodiest conflict in American history. Sarah gathered her equipment from the trunk of her car: electromagnetic field detectors, digital audio recorders, infrared cameras, and a notebook she'd been keeping for 15 years of paranormal investigations. The station was officially closed to the public after dark, but she had special permission from the Historical Society to conduct her research. They had been receiving reports from security guards and maintenance workers about unusual activity in the building, particularly around the old platform where the trains once arrived and departed. As she approached the main entrance, Sarah noticed that the temperature had dropped significantly since sunset. Her breath was visible in the air, and the EMF detector in her hand began to register fluctuations even though she was still outside the building. The station's windows were dark, but she could have sworn she saw movement behind the glass, quick shadows that disappeared when she looked directly at them. The key turned easily in the lock, and the heavy wooden door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through the empty building. Sarah stepped inside and immediately felt the weight of history pressing down on her. The walls were lined with period photographs showing the station during its active years, and display cases held artifacts from the Civil War era. But beneath the museum atmosphere, there was something else, a tension in the air that made her skin prickle. Sarah set up her equipment in the main waiting room, where passengers once sat on wooden benches while waiting for their trains. The EMF readings were off the charts, fluctuating wildly between normal background levels and spikes that suggested a massive electromagnetic disturbance. She started her audio recorders and began taking baseline temperature readings, documenting everything in her notebook with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that paranormal investigation was 90% careful observation and 10% inexplicable terror. The first anomaly occurred at 9:23 p.m. Sarah was examining a display case containing Civil War medical instruments when she heard the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor behind her. She turned around, expecting to see a security guard or perhaps another researcher she hadn't been told about, but the waiting room was empty. The footsteps continued, a slow, measured pace that suggested someone walking with difficulty, perhaps favoring an injured leg. The sound moved across the room, past the ticket window, and toward the door that led to the platform. Sarah followed the sound, her equipment registering increasing electromagnetic activity with each step. The door to the platform was locked, but as she approached it, she heard the distinct sound of the door opening and closing, even though it remained securely shut. The footsteps continued onto the platform, and Sarah could hear them clearly through the door, accompanied now by what sounded like labored breathing and occasional groans of pain. Using a key provided by the Historical Society, Sarah unlocked the platform door and stepped outside. The platform stretched along the tracks, which were still active though no passenger trains stopped here anymore. The October night was clear and cold, with a full moon that cast everything in silver light. But despite the visibility, Sarah saw nothing that could account for the sounds she was hearing. The footsteps had stopped, but now she could hear something else. Voices, faint but unmistakably human, speaking in the distance. As she strained to listen, the voices became clearer, and Sarah realized she was hearing conversations from more than a century past. Men were talking about home, about sweethearts they'd left behind, about battles they'd fought and friends they'd lost. The accents were distinctly 19th century, formal and careful in a way that modern speech had abandoned. Sarah's EMF detector began screaming, registering readings so high they went off the scale. The temperature plummeted another 10 degrees, and her breath now came out in thick clouds that hung in the still air. That's when she saw the first figure. He materialized slowly like a photograph developing in chemicals. At first he was just a vague outline, a suggestion of human form standing near the far end of the platform. But as Sarah watched, he became more solid, more real, until she could make out individual details. He was young, probably no more than 20, wearing the blue wool uniform of a Union soldier. His left arm was in a makeshift sling, and there was a dark stain on his jacket that looked like dried blood. The soldier stood perfectly still, staring down the tracks as if waiting for a train that would never come. His face was pale in the moonlight, and Sarah could see that his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare she'd seen in photographs of Civil War veterans, the look of someone who had seen too much death and horror. As she watched, more figures began to appear. They came in 2s and 3s at first, then in larger groups. Union soldiers in various states of injury and exhaustion, some supporting wounded comrades, others sitting on the platform with their heads in their hands. They were all young, Sarah realized, boys really, who had been aged beyond their years by war. Some bore visible wounds, missing limbs, blood-soaked bandages, faces scarred by shrapnel. Others showed no obvious injury but moved with the careful motions of men in constant pain. The voices grew clearer as more figures appeared. Sarah could hear fragments of conversation, discussions about train schedules and letters from home, complaints about army food and speculation about when the war would end. But underlying all of it was a sense of profound sadness, a collective grief that seemed to permeate the very air around the platform. One soldier, a sergeant based on the stripes on his sleeve, walked directly past Sarah without seeming to see her. He was older than the others, maybe 30, with graying hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. His right leg dragged slightly as he walked, and Sarah noticed that his boot was dark with what looked like blood. As he passed her, she caught a whiff of something that made her stomach turn. The smell of infected wounds and gangrene, the odor of death that had not yet claimed its victim. The sergeant stopped near the edge of the platform and pulled a letter from his breast pocket. Even in the moonlight, Sarah could see that the paper was stained and worn from repeated handling. The sergeant unfolded it carefully and began to read, his lips moving silently as he went through what was obviously a treasured communication from home. When he finished, he folded the letter again and held it against his chest, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. More soldiers continued to arrive, some walking under their own power, others being carried by their comrades. Sarah began to understand what she was witnessing. This was a gathering of the wounded and dying, men who had been brought to the station for transport to hospitals or to be sent home. But these were the ones who had never made it onto the trains, who had died here on the platform while waiting for salvation that came too late. The sound of a train whistle broke the silence, distant but growing closer. The soldiers on the platform began to stir, looking down the tracks with expressions of hope and desperation. The wounded tried to stand, supported by their comrades, while others gathered their few possessions and prepared to board the approaching train. Sarah looked down the tracks but saw nothing, heard nothing except the growing sound of the whistle and the rumble of wheels on rails. The train arrived without appearing. Sarah heard the screech of brakes, the hiss of steam, the heavy sound of a locomotive coming to a stop, but there was no train on the tracks. The soldiers, however, reacted as if a real train had pulled into the station. They began moving toward the edge of the platform, forming lines and helping each other toward doors that Sarah couldn't see. A conductor's voice called out, clear and authoritative, "All aboard for Washington. Train departing for military hospitals. All wounded personnel, board immediately." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the station building and fading into the night air. The soldiers began to board the invisible train, disappearing as they stepped forward into empty air. Sarah watched in fascination and growing horror as dozens of young men simply vanished, fading away as if they had never been there at all. The sergeant with the letter was among the last to board. He looked back once at the station, his eyes scanning the platform as if he was memorizing every detail. For just a moment, his gaze seemed to focus on Sarah, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could see her, that he knew she was watching from more than a century in the future. The sergeant nodded once in her direction, a gesture of acknowledgement or perhaps farewell, then turned and stepped forward into nothingness. He disappeared like the others, leaving only the cold October night and the sound of the invisible train departing. The whistle blew one final time, a long, mournful note that seemed to hang in the air for minutes before finally fading away. Sarah stood alone on the empty platform, her equipment still registering massive electromagnetic disturbances even though all the figures had vanished. She checked her audio recorders and found that they had captured everything. The voices, the footsteps, even the sound of the phantom train. But more than the evidence, she was struck by the profound sadness of what she had witnessed. These were young men who had died far from home, who had spent their final moments waiting for a train that would take them back to the families they would never see again. As she packed up her equipment and prepared to leave, Sarah noticed something that chilled her more than anything else she had experienced that night. On the platform where the sergeant had stood, someone had scratched words into the wooden planks. Still waiting for the train home. October 1863. The scratches looked fresh, as if they had been carved only moments before, and Sarah realized that some wounds, some losses, were too deep ever to heal completely. The drive back to her hotel took her past the Gettysburg battlefield, where thousands of soldiers had died during 3 days in July 1863. As she drove through the darkness, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the phantom train was still making its rounds, still collecting the wounded and the dying, still carrying them on a journey that would never end. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the sound of her car engine, she could have sworn she heard a train whistle calling through the Pennsylvania night. Detective James Rodriguez had seen a lot of strange things during his 15 years with the Cincinnati Police Department, but nothing had prepared him for the call that came in at 11:47 p.m. on a foggy November evening. A security guard at the Cincinnati Museum Center, housed in the restored Union Terminal building, had reported seeing people in vintage clothing wandering through the rotunda after closing hours. The guard, normally a reliable man named Bill Thompson, sounded shaken when he called it in, claiming that the figures appeared and disappeared like smoke and that they seemed to be searching for something. Rodriguez pulled into the circular drive in front of the terminal, the Art Deco masterpiece rising before him like something from another era. Built in 1933 during the height of the Art Deco movement, the building had served as Cincinnati's main train station until the decline of rail travel in the 1970s. Now it housed several museums, but the ghost of its former grandeur lingered in every curve of its streamlined architecture and every gleam of its polished surfaces. Bill Thompson met him at the main entrance, a flashlight shaking slightly in his weathered hands. Thompson had been working security at the terminal for 8 years, and Rodriguez had never seen him anything but calm and professional. Tonight, however, the older man's face was pale, and his eyes held the wide, startled look of someone who had seen something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. "It started about an hour ago," Thompson said as he led Rodriguez through the darkened lobby. "I was doing my regular rounds, checking that all the exhibits were secure, when I heard voices coming from the main rotunda. Thought maybe we had some kids who'd snuck in after closing, but when I got there," he trailed off, shaking his head. "I've never seen anything like it, detective. There were maybe 20 people in there, all dressed like they were from the 1940s or 50s. They were carrying suitcases and looking around like they were lost." The main rotunda was the crown jewel of the terminal, a soaring space topped by a dome decorated with murals depicting transportation through the ages. Even in the dim emergency lighting, Rodriguez could see the beauty of the space, the way the curved walls seemed to flow upward toward the painted ceiling. But there was something else in the air tonight, a tension that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Show me where you saw them," Rodriguez said, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon, though he wasn't sure what good it would do against whatever Thompson had encountered. Thompson led him toward the center of the rotunda, where an information kiosk stood surrounded by benches. "Right here," he said, pointing to an area near the eastern wall where the old train platforms had once been accessible. They were standing around like they were waiting for someone to tell them where to go. Some of them looked confused, others seemed angry. There was this one woman. She was crying and kept asking about Track 7. "But Detective, Track 7 hasn't existed here for 40 years. As Thompson spoke, Rodriguez began to notice changes in the environment around them. The temperature was dropping, and their breath was becoming visible in the air. The emergency lighting seemed to dim, and shadows that had been clearly defined became fuzzy and uncertain. Most unnervingly, Rodriguez could hear something that sounded like distant conversation, voices too faint to understand but clearly human. "There," Thompson whispered, grabbing Rodriguez's arm. "Do you see them?" Rodriguez followed Thompson's gaze toward the eastern wall, and his blood ran cold. Figures were materializing in the dim light, translucent at first but becoming more solid with each passing moment. They appeared to be from different time periods, spanning several decades of the terminal's active years. A woman in a 1940s traveling suit clutched a small suitcase and looked around frantically, her lips moving as if she was asking questions no one could answer. A businessman in a 1950s overcoat checked his pocket watch repeatedly, his face showing growing frustration. A family from what looked like the 1960s huddled together near what had once been the entrance to the train platforms, the children crying while their parents tried to comfort them. What struck Rodriguez most about the scene was the sense of confusion and growing panic among the figures. They weren't the typical ghosts from horror movies, transparent and ethereal. These people looked real, solid, as if they could be touched and spoken to. But there was something wrong with their eyes, something desperate and lost that made Rodriguez's stomach clench with sympathy and fear. The woman in the traveling suit approached the information kiosk and began speaking to someone Rodriguez couldn't see. Her voice was clear enough now for him to understand her words, and what he heard made his blood turn to ice. "Excuse me," she was saying, her voice carrying the precise diction of a bygone era. "I'm supposed to catch the 11:30 to Chicago, but I can't find Track 7. The board says the track is closed, but my ticket clearly states Track 7. There must be some mistake." She held up a ticket, and even from a distance, Rodriguez could see that it was yellowed with age, the kind of cardboard ticket that hadn't been used in decades. The woman waited for a response from the invisible clerk, growing more agitated when none came. "I don't understand," she continued, her voice rising. "I have to get to Chicago tonight. My sister is expecting me. She's getting married tomorrow, and I promised I'd be there. Please, you have to help me find Track 7. The businessman with the pocket watch had noticed the woman's distress and approached her. "Excuse me, miss," he said in a voice that carried just enough of a southern accent to suggest he wasn't from Cincinnati originally. "I'm having the same trouble. My train to Louisville was supposed to depart at 11:15, but there's no one at the ticket counter, and all the tracks seem to be blocked off. Do you know what's happening here?" The family with the crying children had overheard the conversation and joined them. The father, a tall man in a worn but respectable suit, carried a toddler while his wife held the hand of a boy who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. "We've been waiting here for 3 hours," the father said, his voice tight with frustration and worry. "Our train to St. Louis should have left at 9:30. We've got connections to make, and if we miss them, we'll lose everything. I spent my last $20 on these tickets." More figures continued to appear, each carrying luggage and wearing the clothes of different decades from the terminal's heyday. They began to cluster together, sharing their confusion and growing fear. All of them had the same story. They were waiting for trains that should have departed hours ago, heading to destinations where people were expecting them, carrying tickets for tracks that no longer existed. Rodriguez watched the scene unfold with a mixture of professional curiosity and deep unease. As a detective, he was trained to observe and analyze, to look for logical explanations for seemingly inexplicable events. But what he was seeing defied every rational explanation he could think of. "Thompson," he whispered, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening in front of them. "How long has the terminal been closed to passenger service?" "Since 1979, Thompson replied, his voice barely audible. "The last passenger train left on October 28, 1979. But detective, some of those people look like they're from even earlier than that. That woman's clothes, they look like they're from the 1940s, maybe even the 1930s. As if responding to their conversation, the woman in the traveling suit turned and looked directly at Rodriguez and Thompson. Her eyes were wide with desperation, and Rodriguez could see now that there was something wrong with her appearance. Her skin had a waxy, unnatural pallor, and her eyes reflected light in a way that human eyes shouldn't. When she spoke, her voice carried across the rotunda despite the distance between them. "Officers," she called out, and Rodriguez realized she could see them even though they hadn't announced their presence. "Thank goodness you're here. There's been some terrible mistake. All of these people are waiting for trains that don't seem to exist. The tracks are all blocked off, and there's no one at the ticket counters. We need help, please." Rodriguez felt compelled to respond, to try to help these lost souls even though every instinct told him to run. He took a step forward, and Thompson grabbed his arm. "Don't," Thompson whispered urgently. "I tried to help them earlier, tried to tell them the station was closed. They didn't listen, acted like they couldn't hear me. But when I got too close, the temperature dropped so fast I thought I was going to pass out, and I could smell something like decay." But Rodriguez was already moving forward, drawn by the woman's obvious distress. As he approached the group of phantom passengers, the temperature continued to plummet, and he began to smell what Thompson had described. The sickly sweet odor of decomposition mixed with something else, something chemical and sharp that burned his nostrils. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said gently, "I'm afraid there's been some confusion. This building no longer serves as a train station. It's been converted into a museum. There are no passenger trains running from here." The woman stared at him blankly for a moment, as if processing information that didn't make sense. Then her face crumpled, and she began to cry. The sound was heartbreaking, the anguished weeping of someone whose world had just been destroyed. "But I have to get to Chicago," she sobbed. "My sister's wedding is tomorrow. She's counting on me. I promised I'd be there. I can't miss her wedding." The other passengers had heard Rodriguez's words, and a murmur of distress rippled through the group. The businessman with the pocket watch stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "What do you mean there are no trains?" he demanded. "I bought this ticket fair and square. I have business in Louisville that can't wait. You can't just cancel all the trains without notice. I need to get home to my family," the father with the children said, his voice breaking. "My boy is sick, and we spent everything we had on medicine and train tickets. If we can't get home tonight, we'll have nowhere to go." The desperation in their voices was overwhelming, and Rodriguez felt a wave of sympathy that threatened to bring tears to his eyes. These people, whatever they were, genuinely believed they needed to catch trains that no longer ran, to reach destinations where people who had probably been dead for decades were waiting for them. That's when Rodriguez noticed something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The phantom passengers weren't just from different time periods. They were all carrying death with them in subtle ways. The woman in the traveling suit had dark stains on her dress that looked suspiciously like blood. The businessman's face, upon closer inspection, showed signs of trauma, with what looked like a head injury partially concealed by his hat. The family's youngest child, the toddler, hung limply in his father's arms with the unmistakable pallor of death. Rodriguez began to back away slowly, understanding finally flooding through him. These weren't just ghosts. They were the spirits of people who had died in or around the terminal during its active years. They were trapped in the moment of their deaths, forever trying to complete journeys they would never finish, to reach destinations they would never see. As he retreated toward Thompson, the phantom passengers began to follow him, their faces showing increasing desperation. Their movements became more urgent, more frantic, and Rodriguez could see that their appearances were deteriorating. Wounds became visible, the signs of whatever had killed them manifesting as their emotional distress increased. "Please don't leave us here," the woman cried, reaching out toward Rodriguez with hands that were now obviously injured, fingers bent at unnatural angles. "We need help. We need to catch our trains." "The trains are coming," the businessman insisted, but his voice was becoming hollow, echoing as if it came from a great distance. "I can hear them. Can't you hear the whistles?" Rodriguez couldn't hear any train whistles, but he could hear something else that chilled him to the bone. The sound of footsteps on the marble floor, dozens of them, all moving in the same direction. More phantom passengers were arriving, materializing from the shadows and joining the growing crowd of desperate, lost souls. "We need to go," Rodriguez told Thompson, grabbing the security guard's arm and pulling him toward the exit. "Now!" As they hurried through the rotunda toward the main entrance, Rodriguez could hear the voices behind them growing louder, more frantic. The phantom passengers were calling out destinations, pleading for help, demanding information about trains that would never come. Their voices echoed off the domed ceiling, creating a cacophony of desperation that seemed to follow Rodriguez and Thompson as they fled. They didn't stop running until they reached Rodriguez's patrol car, and even then, they could hear the voices coming from inside the terminal. Rodriguez called for backup, though he wasn't sure what he would tell the responding officers. How do you explain phantom passengers waiting for ghost trains in a building that hasn't seen passenger service in over 40 years? The backup officers found nothing when they searched the building. The rotunda was empty and silent, with no trace of the desperate crowd Rodriguez and Thompson had witnessed. But the security cameras told a different story. When Rodriguez reviewed the footage later, he could see himself and Thompson clearly, but they appeared to be talking to empty air, responding to voices and movements that the cameras couldn't detect. Rodriguez never filed an official report about what he had seen that night, but he made sure that future security patrols at the terminal included at least 2 officers, and he quietly arranged for the building to be blessed by clergy from several different faiths. The phantom passengers still appeared occasionally, according to museum staff and security guards, but they seemed less agitated, less desperate. Some said that the blessing had helped them find peace, allowing them to finally board the trains they had been waiting for. Others believed that the spirits were simply trapped in an eternal loop, forever trying to complete journeys that had been interrupted by death. But Rodriguez knew the truth was probably somewhere in between, that some wounds were too deep to heal completely, and some journeys were never meant to end. Urban explorer Maya Santos had photographed abandoned buildings across the Midwest, but nothing had prepared her for the imposing shell of Michigan Central Station in Detroit. Standing 18 stories tall in the Corktown neighborhood, the Beaux-Arts masterpiece had once been the tallest train station in the world. Now it was a hollow monument to Detroit's industrial past, its broken windows staring out like dead eyes over a city that had learned to survive without the prosperity that had once made it great. Maya parked her car on Michigan Avenue as the last light of a gray December day faded behind the station's skeletal towers. She had special permission to photograph inside the building, which had been closed to the public since 1988. The station was scheduled for renovation as part of a massive redevelopment project, but for now it remained frozen in time, a vast empty space where thousands of passengers had once hurried to catch trains to Chicago, New York, and points beyond. The main entrance was secured, but Maya had been given access through a side door that led into what had once been the baggage handling area. As she stepped inside, her footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, the sound seeming to multiply and spread through the darkened corridors like ripples in water. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay, but underneath those odors was something else, something that reminded Maya of the subway stations of her childhood in New York, the metallic scent of old rails and the lingering ghost of coal smoke. Maya made her way through the lower level toward the Grand Concourse, her camera equipment weighing heavy in the backpack slung over her shoulders. The station had been stripped of most of its original fixtures over the years, vandalized and looted until little remained of its former grandeur. But the bones of the building were still magnificent, the soaring spaces and elegant proportions that had made it one of the architectural wonders of its age. The Grand Concourse stretched out before her like the nave of a cathedral, its ceiling lost in shadows high above. During the station's heyday, this space would have been filled with the noise and chaos of departing passengers, the calls of conductors, and the rumble of trains pulling into the platforms below. Now it was silent except for the wind whistling through broken windows and the occasional groan of settling masonry. Maya set up her tripod and began taking long exposure photographs, using the ambient light from the street to illuminate the dramatic architecture. Through her camera lens, she could better appreciate the craftsmanship that had gone into the station's construction, the attention to detail that marked it as a product of an age when public buildings were designed to inspire awe and civic pride. As she worked, Maya began to notice that the silence wasn't as complete as she had first thought. There were sounds coming from deeper in the building, faint but unmistakably human in origin. At first, she attributed them to other urban explorers or perhaps homeless individuals who had found shelter in the abandoned station. But as she listened more carefully, the sounds seemed wrong somehow, too organized and purposeful to be random human activity. Maya followed the sounds toward what had once been the main platform area. The platforms themselves had been partially demolished during the station's abandonment, but the basic structure remained, a long space where trains had once pulled up to disgorge their passengers. As she descended the steps toward the platform level, the sounds became clearer, and Maya realized she was hearing voices, dozens of them, all talking at once in the kind of organized chaos that might be expected in a busy train station. The platform area was darker than the concourse above, illuminated only by the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the damaged roof. But as Maya's eyes adjusted to the gloom, she began to make out shapes moving in the darkness. At first, they were just shadows, indistinct forms that could have been debris shifting in the wind. But as she watched, the shapes became more defined, more obviously human. They were passengers, Maya realized with a shock that made her heart skip a beat. Dozens of people in clothes from different eras, carrying suitcases and packages, moving with the purposeful haste of travelers trying to catch their trains. Some were dressed in the formal attire of the 1920s and 1930s, others in the more casual clothes of the post-war era. A few wore the practical garments of working people heading to jobs in other cities, while others sported the expensive suits and dresses of the well-to-do. Maya raised her camera and began shooting, though she wasn't sure the film would capture what she was seeing. The figures seemed to exist in a different layer of reality, visible but not quite solid, like images projected onto smoke. They moved through their routines with mechanical precision, checking tickets, consulting pocket watches, and conversing with companions who weren't always visible. A woman in a 1940s dress and hat stood near where track 3 had once been, repeatedly checking a piece of paper that Maya assumed was her ticket. The woman would look at the paper, glance up at where the departure board would have been located, then check her wristwatch before repeating the entire sequence. Her movements were identical each time, as if she were trapped in a loop that she couldn't escape. Nearby, a businessman in a three-piece suit paced back and forth along the platform, his agitation growing with each circuit. He kept pulling out a gold pocket watch and shaking his head in frustration, occasionally calling out to conductors who weren't there. "Excuse me," Maya could hear him saying, his voice carrying despite the distance between them. "I need to know about the 8:15 to Chicago. I have an important meeting tomorrow morning, and I simply cannot be late." As Maya continued to observe and photograph the scene, she began to understand that she was witnessing the echoes of countless departures that had taken place on these platforms over the decades of the station's operation. The phantom passengers weren't just random spirits. They were the accumulated memories of all the people who had passed through this space, their hopes and fears and destinations somehow imprinted on the very structure of the building. A family caught Maya's attention, a young couple with two small children who were struggling with an enormous trunk and several smaller bags. The father kept checking tickets while the mother tried to comfort a crying baby. The older child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 5, clutched a doll and looked around with wide, frightened eyes. "The train should have been here by now," the father was saying to his wife, his voice carrying the accent of recent immigrants. "The man at the ticket office said track 5, but there's no train here. What if we missed it? What if they won't let us back on?" The mother bounced the baby gently, her face showing the strain of someone who had been traveling for days. "They have to let us back on," she said, but there was doubt in her voice. "We paid for our passage. They can't just leave us here." Maya felt a pang of sympathy for the family, even though she knew they were beyond any help she could offer. She could see now that the phantom passengers weren't just memories. They were the spirits of people who had died while traveling through the station, or who had experienced such profound trauma during their journeys that their emotional imprints had been burned into the building itself. The realization hit her when she noticed that many of the figures showed signs of injury or illness. The woman checking her ticket had a dark stain on her dress that looked like blood, and her skin had the waxy pallor of someone who was seriously ill. The businessman with the pocket watch moved with a slight limp, and Maya could see that one side of his face was damaged, as if he had been in some kind of accident. The immigrant family's baby had stopped crying, but when Maya looked closer, she realized the child was completely still, its small body limp in its mother's arms. The mother continued to rock and soothe the baby, apparently unaware that it was no longer alive. As this horrible understanding washed over her, Maya heard a new sound that made her blood run cold: the distant whistle of an approaching train. The phantom passengers on the platform heard it too, and their movements became more animated, more urgent. They began gathering their belongings and moving toward the edge of the platform, preparing to board a train that Maya knew couldn't possibly be coming. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the rumble of heavy wheels on steel rails. Maya could feel the vibration through the floor of the platform, and a wind began to blow through the station, carrying with it the smell of coal smoke and hot metal. The phantom passengers pressed forward, jostling for position, their voices rising in excitement and relief. "Finally," the businessman said, snapping his pocket watch closed. "I was beginning to think they'd forgotten about us." "Thank God," breathed the immigrant father, hefting his family's trunk. "Children, stay close to Mama. The train is here." But there was no train. The tracks were empty, rusted and overgrown with weeds. Yet the sounds continued to grow louder, and Maya could see the phantom passengers beginning to board something she couldn't see. They stepped forward into empty air and simply vanished, one by one, as if they were walking through an invisible doorway. The woman with the bloody dress was among the last to board. As she stepped toward the edge of the platform, she turned and looked directly at Maya. Her eyes were black holes in her pale face, and when she smiled, Maya saw that her teeth were stained with blood. "The train is never late," the woman said, her voice carrying clearly across the platform despite the noise of the phantom locomotive. "It always comes eventually, for everyone who's waiting. Your turn will come too, when you're ready to leave." The woman stepped forward and disappeared, leaving Maya alone on the empty platform with only the fading sound of the departing train. The whistle blew one final time, a long, mournful note that echoed through the abandoned station before silence returned. Maya stood frozen for several minutes, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck. She had photographed dozens of allegedly haunted locations, but she had never experienced anything like this. The phantom passengers hadn't been hostile or threatening. They had simply been lost, trapped in an endless cycle of waiting and departure that had no resolution. As she finally gathered her equipment and prepared to leave, Maya noticed something that made her heart race. Fresh footprints in the dust of the platform, leading from where she had been standing to the edge where the phantom passengers had boarded their invisible train. The prints were her own size and shape, but she had no memory of making them. Maya left the station quickly, driving through the dark streets of Detroit with her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She developed her photographs the next day, expecting to find only empty shots of the abandoned platform. But several of the images clearly showed shadowy figures in period dress, their faces visible enough to see the expressions of hope and desperation she remembered so vividly. She never returned to Michigan Central Station, though she heard that other urban explorers and photographers continued to report strange experiences in the building. Some claimed to hear the sounds of phantom trains arriving and departing at all hours of the night. Others spoke of seeing passengers waiting on the platforms, forever anticipating journeys that would never end. Maya kept the photographs in a safety deposit box, taking them out only occasionally to remind herself that some places hold onto the past so tightly that it becomes indistinguishable from the present. And sometimes, late at night when she was editing photographs from other locations, she would hear the distant sound of a train whistle and wonder if the phantom passengers of Michigan Central Station were still boarding their endless train, still searching for destinations they would never reach. The Kansas City Union Station stood majestically against the October night sky, its Beaux-Arts architecture illuminated by carefully placed spotlights that highlighted every architectural detail. Built in 1914, the station had served as a crucial railroad hub for the American Midwest, and during the 1920s and 1930s, it had witnessed the comings and goings of some of the most notorious figures of the Jazz Age, including bootleggers, gangsters, and federal agents in an era when Kansas City was known as one of the most corrupt cities in America. Detective Lieutenant Patricia Williams parked her unmarked police car in the lot adjacent to the station, which now served as a science museum and entertainment complex. She had received a call from the night security supervisor about unusual activity in the restored Grand Hall. Reports of people in period clothing appearing and disappearing, and what sounded like 1920s jazz music coming from areas where no sound system existed. Williams had 23 years of experience with the Kansas City Police Department, and she had learned to take reports of paranormal activity with a healthy dose of skepticism. But the security supervisor, a former police officer named Robert Chen, was someone whose judgment she trusted. If Chen said something unusual was happening at Union Station, it was worth investigating. Chen met her at the main entrance, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious unease. "Lieutenant Williams, thanks for coming out," he said as he led her through the entrance hall toward the Grand Hall. "I been working security here for 5 years, and I never experienced anything like what has been happening tonight. It started around 10 p.m., about an hour after we closed to the public. The Grand Hall was Union Station Euro's crown jewel, a massive space with a barrel-vaulted ceiling that rose 95 feet above the floor. During the Station Euro's heyday, this had been one of the busiest transportation hubs in America, with thousands of passengers passing through daily. The hall had been meticulously restored to its original grandeur, complete with period furniture and architectural details that transported visitors back to the golden age of rail travel. "Show me what you've been seeing," Williams said as they entered the Grand Hall. The space was dimly lit by security lighting, creating pools of light and shadow that emphasized the Euro's dramatic architecture. "It starts with the music," Chun said, stopping near the center of the hall. "Listen." Williams strained her ears, and after a moment, she could hear it. Faint but unmistakable jazz music, the kind of syncopated rhythms and brass arrangements that had defined the 1920s. The music seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the vast space with the ghostly echoes of a bygone era. "There are no sound system active in here right now," Chun continued. "I checked all the audio equipment when the music first started. But Theta not the strangest part. Watch the north end of the hall." Williams followed China's gaze toward the north end of the Grand Hall, where the old ticket windows and information booths had been located. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the carefully restored architecture bathed in security lighting. But as her eyes adjusted to the interplay of light and shadow, she began to make out shapes moving in the dimmer areas. The shapes resolved themselves into human figures, translucent at first but becoming more solid as Williams watched. They were dressed in the fashion of the 1920s and early 1930s. Men in double-breasted suits and fedoras, women in drop-waist dresses and cloche hats. They moved through the hall with the purposeful energy of people who had places to be and trains to catch. But there was something off about their movements, something that suggested they were replaying scenes from decades past. "My God," Williams whispered, her professional skepticism evaporating as she watched the phantom figures go about their business. "How many of them are there?" "It varies," Chun replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes just a few, sometimes dozens. But Lieutenant, there is something else you need to see. Some of these people, I recognize them from old police files." As if summoned by China's words, a figure near the old information booth became more distinct, and Williams felt her breath catch in her throat. The man was tall and well-dressed, wearing an expensive overcoat and carrying a leather briefcase. His face was sharp and intelligent, with the kind of predatory handsomeness that had made him famous in Kansas City's underworld. Williams had seen enough historical photographs to recognize him immediately: Johnny Lazia, the political boss who had controlled much of Kansas City's criminal activity during the 1920s and early 1930s. Lazia appeared to be engaged in conversation with two other men, one of whom carried himself with the rigid posture of a federal agent. The third man was older, well-dressed but nervous, constantly checking his pocket watch and glancing around the hall as if expecting trouble. The conversation seemed heated, with Lazia gesturing emphatically while the federal agent remained stone-faced. "Theta impossible," Williams said, though the evidence was right in front of her eyes. Johnny Lazia was killed in 1934, shot down outside the Park Central Hotel. "I know," Chun replied, "but Theta definitely him. And look over there, by the old departure board." Williams turned to see another group of phantom figures, and this time she recognized the scenario immediately from Kansas City police history. For men in dark suits were standing in a tight circle, their conversation clearly conspiratorial. One of them was consulting what appeared to be a train schedule, while another kept watch for anyone who might be observing them. These were bootleggers, Williams realized, using the busy train station as a meeting place to coordinate their illegal activities. The jazz music grew louder, and Williams could now make out individual instruments. A trumpet, a clarinet, a piano playing the kind of complex harmonies that had revolutionized American music in the 1920s. But the music had an eerie quality, as if it were being filtered through water or played at the bottom of a deep well. More figures began to appear throughout the Grand Hall, and Williams started to understand that she was witnessing a replay of Union Station Euro's role as the crossroads of Kansas City Euro's criminal underworld. During the 1920s and 1930s, the station had been a neutral ground where different factions could meet, where deals were made and information was exchanged. It had been the perfect cover for illegal activities, hidden in plain sight among the thousands of legitimate travelers who passed through daily. A woman in an expensive fur coat materialized near one of the restored benches, her jewelry glittering even in the dim light. She was beautiful in the hard-edged way of someone who had learned to use her looks as a weapon, and Williams could see the bulge of a concealed firearm beneath her coat. The woman was watching the meeting between Lazia and the federal agent with obvious interest, and Williams wondered if she was a spy, a journalist, or simply another player in Kansas City Euro's complex criminal ecosystem. The phantom figures seemed unaware of Williams and China Euro's presence, going about their ghostly business with the single-minded focus of people living through moments of great importance. Williams could hear fragments of their conversations now, words and phrases that painted a picture of a city where crime and politics were inextricably intertwined. The shipment arrives Thursday on the 8:15 from Chicago. She heard one of the bootleggers say to his companions, "Make sure our people are in position at the freight yards. We can't afford any mistakes this time. Pendergast wants to know if you can guarantee the federal boys will look the other way," another voice said, and Williams realized they were discussing Tom Pendergast, the political boss who had controlled Kansas City during its most corrupt period. The conversation between Lazia and the federal agent was becoming more animated, and Williams could see that weapons were being subtly displayed on both sides. The tension in the air was palpable, even though she was watching events that had taken place nearly a century ago. "This has to stop, Johnny," the federal agent was saying, his voice carrying clearly across the hall. "Washington is putting pressure on us to clean up this city, and your name is at the top of the list. You need to consider our offer." Lazia laughed, a sound that held no humor. "Your offer? You mean your threat? But you forget something, Agent Morrison. This is my city. These are my people. You federals come and go, but Kansas City remains." The older man with the pocket watch was growing more agitated, constantly looking over his shoulder as if expecting an attack at any moment. Williams realized he might be an informant, someone caught between the competing forces of organized crime and federal law enforcement. The jazz music reached a crescendo, and suddenly the Grand Hall was filled with phantom figures. They appeared to be from different time periods spanning the Station Euro's most active years, but all of them had the hard, dangerous look of people involved in illegal activities. There were gangsters and malls, federal agents and local police detectives, bootleggers and gamblers, all going about their deadly business in the shadowy world where crime and politics intersected. Williams watched in fascination and growing unease as the various groups maneuvered around each other in what appeared to be an elaborate dance of corruption and violence. Briefcases changed hands, envelopes were passed between conspirators, and weapons were displayed with casual menace. It was like watching a historical reenactment, except that these were Euro actors playing roles. These were the actual spirits of people who had lived and died in Kansas City Euro's criminal underworld. The scene reached its climax when shots rang out across the Grand Hall. Williams instinctively reached for her service weapon, but the gunfire was part of the phantom replay, echoing from walls that had heard similar sounds decades ago. The phantom figures dove for cover behind benches and columns, drawing their own weapons and returning fire. The jazz music continued throughout the gun battle, creating a surreal soundtrack for the violence. Williams saw Johnny Lazia fall, blood spreading across his expensive overcoat as he clutched his chest. The federal agent was down too, his weapon skittering across the marble floor as he collapsed. The woman in the fur coat had disappeared, and the bootleggers were fleeing toward the exits, their meeting interrupted by violence they had probably been expecting all along. As the gunfire faded, the phantom figures began to disappear, fading back into the shadows and silence of the restored Grand Hall. The jazz music continued for a few moments longer. Then it too died away, leaving Williams and Chen alone in the dim security lighting. "Jesus Christ," Williams breathed, her heart pounding from the adrenaline of witnessing the ghostly gun battle. "What the hell was that?" "I think," Chen said slowly, "we just watched a replay of the Kansas City massacre, or something like it. This station saw a lot of violence during the corrupt years. Some of it was never officially recorded, never investigated properly because too many people in power had reasons to cover it up." Williams nodded, understanding beginning to dawn on her. Union Station had been more than just a transportation hub during the 1920s and 1930s. It had been the epicenter of a criminal empire that had extended its influence throughout the Midwest. The phantom figures they had witnessed wearing a Euro tee just random spirits. They were the ghosts of people who had died violently in the shadowy world of organized crime and political corruption. As they prepared to leave the Grand Hall, Williams heard one final sound that made her blood run cold: the distant whistle of a train approaching the station. But no trains ran through Union Station anymore, and the old tracks had been converted to other uses years ago. The whistle grew louder, accompanied by the rumble of heavy wheels and the hiss of steam brakes. "The Midnight Express," Chen whispered, his face pale in the security lighting. "I heard other guards talk about it. They say it comes for the ones who died violently, the ones who never got to finish their business in Kansas City." Williams looked back toward the north end of the Grand Hall and saw a few phantom figures reappearing, different ones this time. They carried suitcases and wore the clothes of travelers, but there was something desperate about their movements, something that suggested they were fleeing rather than simply departing. The train whistle blew one final time, a long, mournful note that seemed to carry the weight of all the violence and corruption that had stained Kansas City Euro's history. Then silence returned to the Grand Hall, leaving Williams and Chen alone with the knowledge that some crimes were too deep, some corruption too pervasive, ever to be fully cleansed from the places where they had occurred. Williams never filed an official report about what she had witnessed that night, but she made sure that Union Station received extra security patrols during the late-night hours. She also spent time researching the Station Euro's history during the corrupt years, learning about the countless acts of violence and intimidation that had taken place within its walls. The phantom figures continued to appear occasionally, according to museum staff and security guards. Some visitors reported hearing jazz music in empty halls, while others claimed to see shadowy figures in 1920s clothing moving through the restored spaces. But the gun battles never repeated themselves, at least not with the same intensity that Williams had witnessed. Perhaps the spirits had finally played out their violent dramas, or perhaps they were simply waiting for the right moment to remind the living that some historical wounds never fully heal. The clock tower of Kansas City's Union Station struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the cavernous halls like a funeral dirge. November rain pelted the grand windows, each droplet catching the amber glow of the vintage light fixtures that had illuminated countless departures and arrivals since 1914. The station, once bustling with thousands of travelers daily, now stood mostly empty in the late hours, save for the occasional cleaning crew and security guard making their rounds through the labyrinthine corridors. Marcus Henderson had been working as a night security guard at Union Station for 3 years, and he thought he'd seen everything the old building had to offer. The homeless seeking shelter, teenagers looking for trouble, urban explorers hoping to capture the perfect Instagram shot of the Art Deco architecture. But nothing had prepared him for what he would encounter on that rain-soaked November night when the temperature dropped to an unseasonable 32 degrees, and the heating system in the East Wing mysteriously malfunctioned. As Marcus began his usual rounds at 11:45 p.m., his footsteps echoed off the terrazzo floors, creating a rhythm that seemed to mock the silence. The grand hall stretched before him like a cathedral, its 95-foot ceiling disappearing into shadows that his flashlight couldn't quite penetrate. The murals depicting Kansas City's history stared down at him with painted eyes that seemed to track his movement. And for the first time in his tenure, Marcus felt truly alone in a way that made his skin crawl. He checked his radio, ensuring it was properly tuned to the security frequency. Static crackled back at him, followed by the distant voice of his supervisor, Janet, calling in from the main office. "Henderson, you copy? Everything quiet on your end?" "Copy that, Janet. Just starting the East Wing sweep now. Weather's getting nasty out there." "Roger. Be careful in that section. Maintenance says the heating's been acting up, and with this cold snap, it's going to be freezing down there." Marcus acknowledged and clipped the radio back to his belt, pulling his jacket tighter as he approached the entrance to the East Wing. The temperature drop was immediate and startling, as if he'd stepped into a walk-in freezer. His breath began to mist, and he could see it dancing in the beam of his flashlight like tiny ghosts fleeing from the light. The East Wing housed what had once been the main passenger platforms, now converted into event space and storage areas. During the day, tourists would wander through, marveling at the restored train cars and reading plaques about the golden age of rail travel. But at night, with only the emergency lighting casting long shadows between the pillars, the space took on an entirely different character. As Marcus walked deeper into the wing, his footsteps seemed to multiply, creating an echo that suggested someone else was walking in perfect synchronization with him. He stopped abruptly, and the echo continued for just a beat too long before falling silent. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and he swept his flashlight in a wide arc, illuminating nothing but empty space and the ghostly outlines of old railway equipment. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the vastness of the space. "Security. If anyone's in here, you need to identify yourself." Silence answered him, thick and oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of rain against the high windows. Marcus continued his patrol, but now every shadow seemed to writhe with potential threat. Every corner held the possibility of something watching him. The cold was becoming more intense, and he noticed that his flashlight beam seemed dimmer than usual, as if the very air was absorbing the light. It was then that he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a train whistle, low and mournful, echoing through the station. Marcus froze, his blood turning to ice water in his veins. There were no active train lines running through Union Station anymore. The last passenger train had departed decades ago, and the tracks were now part of the historical display. The whistle came again, closer this time, followed by the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails. The sound was impossible, yet undeniably real, reverberating through the stone and steel of the old station like a heartbeat from another era. Marcus grabbed his radio with shaking hands. "Janet, do you copy? I'm hearing train sounds in the East Wing. Are we running some kind of sound system for an event?" Static answered him for several long seconds before Janet's voice crackled through, distant and filled with interference. "Henderson? What did you say? You're breaking up." "Train sounds, Janet. I'm hearing a train whistle and wheels. Is there supposed to be some kind of audio presentation running?" More static, then fragments of Janet's voice. "No. Event. Nothing scheduled. Can barely. The radio went dead. leaving Marcus alone with the growing sound of an approaching locomotive. The clacking of the wheels was getting faster, more urgent, and now he could hear the hiss of steam and the grinding of brakes. The platform beneath his feet began to vibrate, a subtle tremor that grew stronger with each passing second. Marcus turned toward what had once been Platform 3, the main departure point for the California Limited and other famous trains of the past. Through the gloom, he could see a faint light approaching, growing brighter and more defined. It was the headlight of a locomotive, cutting through the darkness like a malevolent eye, accompanied by the rhythmic chuff-chuff-chuff of a steam engine under full power. But this was impossible. There were no tracks active in this section of the station. The rails had been removed or covered over years ago during the renovation. Yet the train was coming, its presence undeniable and terrifying in its impossibility. As the ghostly locomotive drew closer, Marcus could make out more details in its ethereal glow. It was an old steam engine, probably from the 1940s, with a distinctive streamlined design and chrome accents that caught the supernatural light. Behind it trailed a string of passenger cars, their windows glowing with a sickly yellow radiance that revealed shadowy figures seated within. The train began to slow, its brakes screaming against wheels that shouldn't exist, on tracks that had been gone for 30 years. Marcus found himself unable to move, transfixed by the sight of this phantom locomotive pulling into a station that existed in some twisted echo of the past. The air around him grew even colder, and now he could see his breath in thick, white clouds that seemed to take on shapes of their own before dissipating. As the train came to a complete stop, the silence that followed was more oppressive than any sound. The passenger car doors remained closed, but Marcus could see the figures inside more clearly now. They were dressed in clothing from decades past, women in fitted dresses and cloche hats, men in sharp suits and fedoras. All of them sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead with eyes that reflected the train's ghostly light like mirrors. Then, with a mechanical hiss that seemed to echo from another dimension, one of the car doors began to slide open. Marcus wanted to run, every instinct screaming at him to flee, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. From within the car, a figure began to emerge, a conductor in a navy blue uniform, his brass buttons gleaming despite the otherworldly nature of his presence. The conductor's face was pale, almost translucent, with features that seemed to shift and blur when Marcus tried to focus on them. In his hand, he carried an old-fashioned lantern that cast dancing shadows on the platform. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the vast space of the station. "All aboard," the conductor called, his words carrying the weight of decades and the chill of the grave. "Last call for the Midnight Express. All passengers must be ticketed for their final destination." The conductor's gaze fixed on Marcus, and in those hollow eyes, the security guard saw something that made his soul recoil. It wasn't malevolence, exactly, but rather an inhuman patience, as if this spectral figure had been waiting for decades for the right passenger to board his impossible train. "You there?" the conductor said, raising his lantern higher. "Do you have your ticket?" Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I don't. I'm not a passenger. I work here. Security." The conductor tilted his head, considering this response with the deliberate slowness of someone who existed outside the normal flow of time. "Everyone's a passenger eventually," he said. "The question is whether you're ready to board, or if you'll be taking a later departure." Behind the conductor, other figures began to move within the passenger cars. They turned their heads in unison to look out at Marcus, their faces pressed against the windows like pale flowers against glass. Some of them began to tap on the windows with skeletal fingers, the sound sharp and urgent in the cold air. The train's whistle blew again, a sound so mournful and filled with longing that Marcus felt tears spring to his eyes without understanding why. The conductor began to move toward him, his feet making no sound on the platform, the lantern swinging hypnotically back and forth. "You feel it, don't you?" the conductor asked. "The pull of the rails, the call of the journey. Some folks, they fight it their whole lives, but eventually, everyone takes their seat." Marcus found that he was taking a step forward, then another. There was something compelling about the conductor's words, something that spoke to a deep exhaustion he hadn't even realized he carried. The warm glow emanating from the passenger cars seemed welcoming now, promising rest and escape from the endless nights of walking empty corridors and checking locked doors. But as he drew closer to the train, Marcus caught a glimpse of the passengers' faces more clearly. Their eyes were empty sockets, black holes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their mouths hung open in silent screams, and their hands pressed against the windows left no prints, as if they had no substance at all. The realization hit him like a physical blow. These weren't passengers on some mystical journey. They were the trapped, the lost, the souls who had boarded this phantom train and found themselves unable to ever disembark. The warm light wasn't welcoming. It was hungry, drawing him toward a fate worse than death. Marcus jerked backward, breaking whatever spell the conductor had been weaving around him. The spectral figure's face twisted into something like disappointment, but also grim understanding. "Not tonight, then," the conductor said, stepping back toward his impossible train. "But remember, we run this route every night at midnight. Your seat will be waiting whenever you're ready to claim it." The conductor climbed back aboard, and with another blast of the whistle, the phantom locomotive began to move. It picked up speed quickly, the cars sliding past Marcus in a blur of ghostly light and desperate faces. Within moments, the train had vanished into the darkness beyond the platform, leaving behind only the gradually fading sound of wheels on tracks that didn't exist. Marcus stood alone in the sudden silence, his heart pounding and his whole body shaking from more than just the cold. His radio crackled back to life, Janet's voice clear and concerned. "Henderson, are you there? You went off the air for about 20 minutes. Everything okay?" Marcus looked at his watch, confused. It was 12:47 a.m. The entire encounter had felt like it lasted only a few minutes, but somehow nearly an hour had passed. He keyed his radio with a trembling hand. "I'm here, Janet. Just equipment malfunction. Everything's quiet now." But as Marcus completed his rounds and headed back toward the main security office, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. And deep in his bones, he could still feel the vibration of wheels on phantom tracks, a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat and whisper a promise. The midnight train would return, and someday he might find himself ready to board. The heating system in the East Wing mysteriously resumed normal operation the next morning, and no maintenance records could be found of any malfunction. Marcus requested a transfer to day shifts, citing personal reasons, but he never told anyone about the conductor's promise. Some nights, though, he would wake at exactly midnight, listening for the distant sound of a train whistle calling through the darkness. The magnificent cathedral ceiling of St. Louis Union Station stretched 120 feet above Sarah Chen's head as she made her way through the Grand Hall, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting that had been installed when the station was converted into a luxury hotel and shopping complex. It was 2:15 a.m. on a bitterly cold February morning, and as the night audit manager, Sarah was responsible for ensuring that all areas of the historic complex remained secure and undisturbed until the morning staff arrived. Sarah had been working nights at the hotel for 8 months, ever since her divorce had left her needing both the steady income and the solitude that came with the graveyard shift. She'd grown to love the peaceful hours when the tourists and shoppers were gone, leaving her alone with the magnificent architecture and the whispered stories that seemed to emanate from every brick and beam of the century-old structure. The station had been completed in 1894, and in its heyday, it had been the largest and busiest passenger rail terminal in the world. Hundreds of thousands of travelers had passed through its gates, carrying their hopes, dreams, and darkest secrets in leather suitcases and steamer trunks. Now, transformed into a modern entertainment complex, it still retained that sense of transient energy, as if the building itself remembered every goodbye that had been whispered on its platforms. Tonight felt different, though. There was a heaviness in the air that Sarah couldn't quite identify, an electric tension that made her skin prickle with unease. The February wind howled outside the tall windows, rattling the glass and sending strange shadows dancing across the ornate plasterwork. The heating system was working overtime, but somehow the building felt colder than usual, as if the very walls were drawing warmth from the air. Sarah's route took her through the hotel lobby, past the closed shops and restaurants, and down into the lower levels where the original train platforms had been preserved as part of the historical exhibit. Most guests never ventured down here at night, put off by the dimmer lighting and the echoing acoustics that amplified every sound. But Sarah found comfort in these spaces, feeling connected to the generations of travelers who had waited here for trains that would carry them to new lives. As she descended the stairs to the platform level, her keycard reader began to malfunction, beeping erratically and flashing red instead of its usual green. She tried it several times, growing increasingly frustrated as the device seemed to develop a mind of its own. Finally, on the fifth attempt, it worked, and the heavy door clicked open with a sound like a sigh. The platform area was darker than usual, with several of the LED fixtures flickering or completely dark. Sarah made a mental note to report the lighting issues to maintenance, but first she needed to complete her security sweep. The exhibition space contains several restored rail cars from different eras, each one carefully maintained and protected behind velvet ropes and motion sensors. She was checking the climate control readings on a 1940s dining car when she heard it, the distinctive sound of someone dragging something heavy across a hard floor. It was coming from deeper in the platform area, beyond the tourist displays, in the section that housed the facility's storage rooms and utility spaces. Sarah paused, listening intently. The sound came again, a rhythmic scraping punctuated by what sounded like metal clasps or buckles jingling together. It was the kind of sound someone might make while dragging a large suitcase across a concrete floor, the wheels broken or missing, the leather corners scraping against the ground. "Hello," Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the vast space. "Security. If someone's down here, you need to identify yourself." The dragging sound stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat. She waited, counting to 30, but no response came. Pulling out her radio, she tried to contact the front desk, but got only static in return. The thick stone walls of the lower level were notorious for interfering with radio signals, but tonight the interference seemed particularly severe. Sarah continued her patrol, moving toward the source of the sound with her flashlight held high. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing empty platform spaces and the ghostly outlines of maintenance equipment. As she rounded a corner near what had once been the baggage handling area, her light fell upon something that made her stomach clench with inexplicable dread. There, in the middle of the corridor, sat a large leather suitcase. It was clearly vintage, with brass corner protectors and leather straps that had been worn smooth by countless hands. The case was covered in old travel stickers from hotels and destinations around the world: Paris, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, a collection that spoke of extensive journeys spanning decades. But what made Sarah's skin crawl was the fact that the suitcase hadn't been there during her previous rounds. She was methodical in her security checks, following the same route every night, and she would have noticed something so obviously out of place. Yet here it sat, as if it had been waiting for her to find it. As Sarah approached the suitcase, she noticed that the leather was wet, not just damp but actually dripping, as if it had been left out in a rainstorm. But that was impossible. The platform area was completely enclosed, and there had been no leaks or water damage in this section of the building. The water that pooled around the case had an odd, viscous quality, and in the beam of her flashlight, it seemed to have a faint reddish tinge. The brass nameplate on the side of the suitcase caught her attention. In elegant script, it read, "Margaret Holloway, Final Destination." The words sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the temperature. There was something ominous about that phrase, something that suggested this wasn't luggage waiting to be claimed, but rather something that had reached the end of a very dark journey. Sarah circled the suitcase warily, noting that it was positioned directly under one of the broken light fixtures. In the semi-darkness, she could see that one of the clasps was undone, leaving the case partially open. A sliver of the interior was visible, revealing what looked like old clothing or fabric, but the shadows made it impossible to see clearly. Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself kneeling beside the suitcase. Every rational part of her mind was screaming warnings, telling her to leave the case alone and call for backup. But there was something compelling about the mystery, something that drew her forward despite her fear. Her hand reached out toward the undone clasp, trembling slightly in the cold air. The moment her fingers made contact with the brass fitting, the temperature around her plummeted even further. Her breath came out in thick clouds, and frost began to form on the metal surfaces nearby. The second clasp on the suitcase popped open on its own with a sharp click that echoed through the platform like a gunshot. From within the case came a sound that defied description, part whisper, part moan, like the last breath of someone dying. The fabric inside began to move, shifting and writhing as if something was trying to free itself from beneath the layers of old clothing. Sarah jerked her hand back, but found herself unable to look away as the suitcase slowly began to open wider. A pale hand emerged from the opening, fingers long and elegant, but clearly belonging to someone long dead. The skin had a translucent quality, and dark veins were visible beneath the surface. The hand was followed by an arm, then a shoulder, as something that had once been a woman began to pull itself from the impossible confines of the suitcase. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound emerged from her throat. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't respond to her commands. All she could do was watch in horror as Margaret Holloway, for surely this was the woman whose name graced the luggage tag, continued her emergence from what should have been a space far too small to contain a human body. Margaret's face was the last thing to appear, and it was a sight that would haunt Sarah's dreams for years to come. Once beautiful, the features were now gaunt and hollow, with eyes that held the depth of decades of suffering. Her dark hair hung in wet strings around her shoulders, and when she opened her mouth, no breath came out, only the sound of wind through empty spaces. "I've been waiting," Margaret whispered, her voice like autumn leaves scraping across stone. "Waiting so long for someone to help me find my train. Do you know when the next departure is?" Sarah finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. There are no trains here anymore. This is a hotel now, a shopping center." Margaret's expression shifted to one of confusion, then growing agitation. "But I have a ticket," she said, reaching into the pocket of her vintage dress with shaking fingers. "I purchased my ticket, and I was told the train would be here. Can't miss it. I simply cannot miss it." The ticket she produced was yellow with age, the printing faded but still legible. It was dated September 15th, 1952, for passage on the Texas Eagle from St. Louis to Los Angeles. Margaret clutched it to her chest as if it were a lifeline. 70 years, Sarah whispered, understanding beginning to dawn on her. "You've been waiting 70 years. Margaret's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, instead evaporating before they could reach her cheeks. "My sister was getting married," she said, "in California. I was to be her maid of honor. But I got sick, so terribly sick, and they wouldn't let me board. They said I had to wait, that there would be another train. But I kept getting worse, and the fever took me before I could make the journey." The story poured out of Margaret in a rush, each word heavy with decades of trapped longing and unfulfilled obligation. She had died of pneumonia in the station's medical facility, her body discovered days later in what was then a small infirmary. Her suitcase had been stored with other unclaimed luggage, eventually lost in the bureaucratic shuffle as the station changed hands and purposes over the decades. "I need to reach California," Margaret pleaded, rising from the suitcase with movements that seemed to defy gravity. "My sister is waiting. The wedding is tomorrow, and I promised I would be there." Sarah wanted to explain that the wedding was 70 years in the past, that Margaret's sister was almost certainly dead, that the world had moved on without her. But looking into those desperate, hollow eyes, she found she couldn't crush the hope that had sustained this tormented soul for decades. Instead, she found herself saying, "Let me help you find information about trains to California." Margaret's face brightened with gratitude so profound that it was almost painful to witness. "Oh, thank you," she whispered. "I knew someone would eventually help me. The kind people always do." Sarah led Margaret through the platform area, the ghostly woman gliding beside her with footsteps that made no sound. As they walked, Margaret spoke about her life, her sister, her excitement about the wedding. She talked about the dress she had packed, blue silk with pearl buttons, and the speech she had prepared for the reception. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if the act of sharing these memories was returning some measure of life to her. They reached the area where the old departure boards had been preserved as part of the historical display. The boards still showed train schedules from the station's final years of operation, though none of the routes listed would help Margaret reach her destination. As Margaret studied the boards, her expression gradually changed from hope to confusion, then to a dawning horror. "These dates," she whispered, pointing at the schedule. "These are all wrong. This says 1978. That can't be right." Sarah gently placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder, surprised to find that she could actually touch the spectral woman. "Margaret, I need to tell you something. The year is 2025. You've been gone for a long time." The transformation that came over Margaret was heartbreaking to witness. The hope drained from her features, replaced by a desolation so complete that Sarah felt her own heart breaking in response. Margaret sank to her knees on the platform, her vintage dress pooling around her like spilled water. "Then she's gone," Margaret whispered. "My sister, the wedding, all of it. I missed it all." "I'm so sorry," Sarah said, kneeling beside the grieving spirit. "But maybe it's time to let go, to find peace." Margaret looked up at Sarah with eyes that now held a different kind of understanding. "You're right," she said softly. "I've been holding on to something that was already lost. But I was so afraid of disappointing her, of breaking my promise." As Margaret spoke these words, the air around them began to warm. The oppressive cold that had gripped the platform area started to lift, replaced by something that felt almost like a gentle spring breeze. Margaret's appearance began to change as well, the pallor of death giving way to a soft luminescence. "Thank you," Margaret said, rising to her feet with renewed grace, "for helping me understand, for giving me the courage to finally board my rail train." In the distance, Sarah could hear the sound of a whistle, not the mournful cry of a phantom locomotive, but something warm and welcoming, like a call to come home. Margaret heard it too, her face lighting up with joy. "That's my train," she said, moving toward the sound. "The one I was always meant to take." As Margaret walked away, her figure began to fade, becoming translucent and then dissolving entirely into motes of light that danced in the air before dispersing. The vintage suitcase had vanished as well, leaving behind only a faint impression in the dust and the lingering scent of jasmine perfume. Sarah remained on the platform for a long time after Margaret had gone, processing what she had experienced. When she finally made her way back to the hotel proper, the lights were working normally, and her radio crackled back to life with a message from the front desk asking for a routine status update. She never reported what she had witnessed that night, but word spread among the night staff about the woman in the vintage dress who had been seen walking the platforms, no longer searching for a train but seemingly at peace with her eternal journey. And sometimes, on particularly cold February nights, guests staying in rooms overlooking the old platform areas reported catching glimpses of a soft light moving through the darkness, accompanied by the faint scent of jasmine and the distant sound of a train whistle calling souls home. The snow began falling at 9:47 p.m., just as Tom Brennan clocked in for his shift as overnight maintenance supervisor at Denver Union Station. By midnight, what had started as gentle flurries had transformed into a full-blown blizzard, with winds howling down from the Rocky Mountains and temperatures dropping to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. The historic train station, now serving as the centerpiece of Denver's downtown transit hub, stood defiant against the storm, its Beaux-Arts facade illuminated by snow-laden streetlights that cast everything in an otherworldly blue-white glow. Tom had been working nights at Union Station for 12 years, ever since his retirement from the Denver Fire Department, and he thought he knew every sound the century-old building could make. The creaking of thermal expansion and contraction as temperatures fluctuated, the whistle of wind through the ventilation systems, the occasional rumble of late-night buses arriving at the underground concourses. But tonight, as he made his rounds through the mostly empty station, something felt fundamentally different. The great hall stretched before him, its soaring ceiling lost in shadows cast by the ornate light fixtures. During the day, this space bustled with commuters, tourists, and travelers making connections between trains, buses, and the airport rail line. But in the deep of night during a blizzard, it felt like a mausoleum, vast and echoing and somehow hungry for human presence. Tom's first stop was always the mechanical room in the basement, where he checked the heating systems and backup generators. The blizzard had already caused 2 brief power outages, and with the temperature continuing to drop, maintaining heat throughout the massive complex was critical. As he descended the stairs, his work boots echoing off the concrete steps, he noticed that his flashlight beam seemed dimmer than usual, as if the very air was absorbing the light. The basement level of Union Station had always felt different from the rest of the building. It was here that the original rail infrastructure remained largely intact, though unused, a maze of tunnels, storage rooms, and mechanical spaces that stretched far beyond what most people realized. During the station's heyday in the 1940s and 1950s, these underground areas had been bustling with activity. Baggage handlers, maintenance crews, and the army of workers who kept the trains running on schedule. As Tom checked the boiler readings, he became aware of a sound that seemed to come from deeper in the basement complex, a rhythmic tapping, like someone sending Morse code on a telegraph key. The sound was faint but persistent, coming in short bursts followed by longer pauses, as if someone was trying to transmit a message through the building's infrastructure itself. Tom had heard stories from the old-timers who had worked at Union Station during its operational days. They spoke of Henry Caldwell, the night telegraph operator who had stayed at his post during the infamous blizzard of 1949, continuing to relay critical messages even as the storm knocked out power lines and buried the city under 4 feet of snow. According to the stories, Henry had died at his telegraph key during that storm, found frozen solid at his desk 3 days later when the snow finally stopped and rescue crews could reach the station. The tapping sound grew more insistent, and Tom found himself following it through the basement corridors. He passed storage rooms filled with forgotten equipment from the station's various renovation projects, old rail cars that had been stripped for parts, and utility spaces that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in decades. The sound seemed to be leading him toward the oldest section of the basement, where the original foundation stones still bore the marks of the craftsman who had laid them more than a century ago. As he rounded a corner near what had once been the main telegraph office, Tom's flashlight illuminated something that made him stop short. There, in the middle of the corridor, sat an old wooden desk equipped with a vintage telegraph key and sounder. The brass components gleamed despite their obvious age, and papers were scattered across the desktop as if someone had been working there recently. The telegraph key was moving on its own, tapping out a complex pattern of dots and dashes with mechanical precision. Each tap was accompanied by the corresponding sound from the sounder, creating the rhythm that had drawn Tom to this forgotten corner of the station. But what truly unsettled him was that there was no one seated at the desk, no visible source for the key's movement. Tom approached the desk slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. He had been a firefighter for 25 years before taking this job, and he prided himself on keeping calm in dangerous situations. But this was beyond his experience, something that challenged his understanding of what was possible. The papers on the desk were telegrams, both incoming and outgoing messages written in the formal style of mid-20th century railroad communications. As Tom read them by the light of his flashlight, he began to piece together a story of increasing desperation. The messages spoke of trains delayed by the storm, passengers stranded at stations throughout Colorado and Wyoming, and growing concerns about supplies and safety as the blizzard intensified. The most recent message, still partially visible in the telegraph sounder's output roll, was dated March 18, 1949, and contained an urgent request for emergency supplies to be sent to several isolated mountain stations where passengers and crew were running out of food and heating fuel. At the bottom of the message, in careful handwriting, was the signature H. Caldwell, Night Op. As Tom studied the message, the telegraph key suddenly stopped its mechanical tapping. In the silence that followed, he became aware of another sound, the soft scrape of a chair being pushed back from the desk. He looked up to see a figure materializing in the dim light beyond his flashlight beam. The man was middle-aged, wearing a railroad uniform that belonged to the 1940s, a dark blue jacket with brass buttons, wool trousers, and a cap with the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad insignia. His face was pale and drawn with exhaustion, as if he had been working without sleep for days. But it was his eyes that truly disturbed Tom. They held a depth of responsibility and determination that seemed almost unbearable. "Are you here about the supply run?" the figure asked, his voice carrying the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to handling emergencies. "We've got 17 passengers stranded at the Moffett Tunnel station, and the temperature's dropping fast. They won't make it through another night without heat." Tom found his voice after several attempts. Who are you? How did you get down here?" The man looked confused, as if the question didn't make sense. "Henry Caldwell, night telegraph operator. I've been trying to coordinate relief efforts all night, but the lines keep going down. We need to get word to Denver about the supply situation." It was then that Tom noticed the frost forming on Henry's uniform, the way his breath came out in visible clouds despite the fact that the basement heating was working perfectly. The temperature around the telegraph desk seemed to be at least 20 degrees colder than the rest of the corridor. "Henry," Tom said carefully, "what year do you think it is?" The ghostly operator paused in his work, looking up with growing confusion. "It's 1949, of course. March 18th. The worst blizzard in Colorado history, and I'm the only one who can maintain communications with the mountain stations. If I don't keep these lines open, people are going to die." Tom realized he was looking at a man who had never stopped working, who had been trapped in this moment of crisis for more than 70 years. Henry Caldwell had died at his post during the 1949 blizzard, but somehow his sense of duty had anchored his spirit to this place, compelling him to continue his desperate attempts to save lives that had either already been saved or lost decades ago. "The people at those mountain stations," Tom said gently. "What happened to them?" Henry's expression grew more agitated. "That's what I'm trying to determine. I lost contact with Moffat Tunnel around 2 a.m., and the last message from Fraser was garbled. The storm is interfering with the lines, but I have to keep trying. Lives depend on it." Tom pulled out his phone, grateful to see that he still had signal despite being in the basement. A quick search revealed the historical records of the 1949 blizzard and the heroic efforts of railroad personnel to maintain communications and coordinate rescue efforts. Henry Caldwell was mentioned by name as one of the heroes who had stayed at his post until the very end. More importantly, Tom found the records showing that all passengers stranded at the mountain stations had been successfully rescued, thanks in large part to the communications network that Henry had maintained until his death. The supply runs had gone through, the rescue trains had reached their destinations, and not a single civilian life had been lost during the entire crisis. "Henry," Tom said, approaching the desk with newfound understanding, "I need to tell you something important. The rescue operations were successful. All the passengers at the mountain stations were saved. Your messages got through, and the supply runs reached everyone who needed help." Henry looked up from his telegraph key, hope and disbelief warring in his ghostly features. "Are you certain? I haven't received confirmation from any of the stations in hours." "I'm certain," Tom replied, showing Henry the historical records on his phone. "Look at this. It's all documented. Your work saved lives that night. The communications network you maintained was the key to coordinating the rescue efforts." As Henry read the information on the phone screen, his expression began to change. The lines of worry and exhaustion that had marked his features for 7 decades started to smooth away, replaced by something that looked like peace. "They all made it," Henry whispered, tears forming in his eyes. "Everyone got home safely." "Yes," Tom confirmed, "because of you. Because you stayed at your post and did your job when it mattered most." The telegraph key gave one final tap, then fell silent. The papers on the desk began to fade, becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely. Henry's uniform seemed to straighten, the brass buttons polishing themselves to a brilliant shine. "I can finally sign off," Henry said, reaching for the telegraph key one last time. He tapped out a final message in Morse code, the letters spelling out, "All stations clear. Operations complete. Henry Caldwell, night op, going off duty." As the last tap echoed through the basement corridor, Henry stood and saluted Tom with military precision. "Thank you for bringing me the confirmation I needed. I can rest now." The ghostly figure began to fade, but before he disappeared entirely, Henry spoke one last time. "Take care of this place. Union Station has always been about bringing people safely home. That mission continues, even if the trains don't run the same routes anymore." With that, Henry Caldwell finally vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of machine oil and the distant echo of a job well done. The vintage telegraph equipment disappeared as well, replaced by the modern electrical panel that belonged in that section of the basement. Tom stood alone in the corridor, processing what he had witnessed. The blizzard outside was beginning to subside, and through the basement windows, he could see the first hints of dawn creeping across the snow-covered city. His radio crackled to life with a status update from the night security supervisor. breaking the spell of the supernatural encounter. As Tom completed his rounds and prepared for the day shift to arrive, he found himself thinking about Henry Caldwell and the dedication that had bound the man's spirit to this place for over 70 years. The railroad era was long past, but Union Station continued to serve as a vital transportation hub, bringing people together and sending them safely on their journeys. From that night forward, Tom always felt a presence during his basement rounds, not threatening but protective, as if Henry's spirit had found peace but still watched over the station he had served so faithfully. And on nights when winter storms battered the city and the wind howled through the building's corridors, Tom would sometimes hear the faint tapping of a telegraph key, sending out a final message that all was well and everyone was safely home. The morning newspapers reported that the blizzard had been one of the worst in Denver's recent history, but no lives were lost, and all transportation services resumed normal operations within hours of the storm's passing. Some said it was due to excellent preparation and modern weather forecasting. Tom knew better. Some guardian angels never truly go off duty. The wind that swept down from the Wasatch Mountains carried with it the bitter promise of an early winter as Rebecca Martinez made her final security sweep of Ogden Union Station. It was 1:30 a.m. on a November night that had already claimed 2 lives in weather-related accidents on the highways leading into town, and the temperature was dropping toward what forecasters warned would be record-breaking lows for the season. As the senior night security officer for the Utah State Railroad Museum, housed within the beautifully restored 1924 station building, Rebecca had seen her share of strange occurrences over the past 5 years, but nothing had prepared her for what she would encounter on this particular night. Ogden Union Station had been built during the golden age of railroading, when the city served as a crucial junction point for multiple transcontinental lines. The station had witnessed countless arrivals and departures, from ordinary passengers traveling to visit family to celebrities and politicians crossing the country in luxury private cars. But it had also been the site of one of the most horrific railroad accidents in Utah history, an event that had left scars on both the building and the collective memory of the community. The accident had occurred on November 15, 1952, when a westbound passenger train carrying 127 people had encountered a catastrophic brake failure while approaching the station at excessive speed. The locomotive and first 3 cars had derailed spectacularly, crashing into the station platform and causing a fire that had burned for hours before emergency crews could bring it under control. 23 passengers and crew members had lost their lives, and their screams had echoed through the station's halls until the very end. As Rebecca walked through the museum's exhibits, her flashlight beam illuminating vintage locomotives and carefully preserved railroad artifacts, she found herself thinking about those victims and wondering if any trace of their final moments lingered in the building's memory. The museum had been tastefully designed to honor the railroad heritage without dwelling on the tragedy, but sometimes Rebecca felt as though the walls themselves retained echoes of that terrible night. Her route took her through the museum's main exhibition hall, past the restored 1950s passenger car that served as one of the museum's centerpiece displays. The car had been meticulously renovated to show how passengers would have traveled during the era when Ogden Station was at its busiest, complete with period-appropriate seating, lighting, and even recorded announcements that played during daytime hours to enhance the visitor experience. As Rebecca approached the passenger car to check its security systems, she noticed that the interior lights were on, casting a warm glow through the windows. This was unusual, as all exhibit lighting was programmed to shut down automatically at 10 p.m. to conserve energy and reduce wear on the vintage fixtures. She made a note to check the control panel, but first she wanted to investigate the car itself. The door to the passenger car stood slightly ajar, another anomaly that set Rebecca's nerves on edge. The museum's policy was to keep all interactive exhibits securely locked overnight, both for security reasons and to prevent damage to the irreplaceable artifacts. As she reached for the door handle, Rebecca heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of voices coming from inside the car, multiple conversations overlapping in the way that would be typical of a passenger train during travel. Rebecca keyed her radio to contact the main security desk, but received only static in response. The radio had been working perfectly during her earlier rounds, but now it seemed completely dead. She tried her cell phone, but discovered that she had no signal bars despite being in an area where coverage was normally excellent. Steeling herself for what she might find, Rebecca pulled the car door open and stepped inside. The interior was exactly as she had seen it hundreds of times before during her security rounds, but now it was occupied by passengers who shouldn't have been there. Men in suits and fedoras sat reading newspapers with dates she couldn't quite make out, while women in fitted dresses and pearls chatted quietly among themselves. Children pressed their faces against the windows, watching the darkness outside with the endless fascination of young travelers. What made the scene truly unsettling was that none of the passengers acknowledged Rebecca's presence. They continued their conversations and activities as if she were invisible, going through the motions of their journey with mechanical precision. Their voices seemed to come from a great distance, even though she was standing among them, and their faces had a translucent quality that made them appear more like photographs than living people. Rebecca tried to speak to the nearest passenger, a middle-aged man in a brown suit who was checking his pocket watch with obvious concern. "Excuse me, sir, but visitors aren't allowed in the museum after hours." The man looked right through her, his expression growing more agitated as he continued to study his timepiece. "We should have reached the station by now," he said to no one in particular. "The schedule shows arrival at 11:47, and it's already past midnight." A woman across the aisle turned toward him, her voice carrying the kind of forced cheerfulness people use when trying to hide their own anxiety. "I'm sure there's just a delay, Mr. Patterson. These mountain routes can be unpredictable in November weather." As Rebecca listened to this exchange, she began to understand what she was witnessing. These weren't random ghostly passengers. They were the victims of the 1952 derailment, trapped forever in the final minutes before their train had crashed into Ogden Station. They were experiencing the approach to their destination, unaware that their journey would end in tragedy rather than safe arrival. The realization was confirmed when Rebecca noticed the date on one of the newspapers being read by a passenger near the front of the car. November 15th, 1952. The headlines spoke of the Korean War, President Truman's policies, and other events from that era. But it was the date that made Rebecca's hands tremble as she backed toward the car's exit. Before she could reach the door, the phantom passengers began to react to something that Rebecca couldn't see or hear. The man with the pocket watch stood up abruptly, his face pale with alarm. "Something's wrong," he announced to the car. "We're going too fast, much too fast." The woman who had tried to reassure him moments before now gripped her seat with white knuckles. "The engineer must know what he's doing," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Other passengers began to notice the excessive speed as well. A businessman near the back of the car pointed out the window and said, "Those telegraph poles are going by awfully quick, and look at how the car is swaying." Children who had been quietly playing began to whimper and cling to their parents. The entire atmosphere in the passenger car shifted from mild concern to growing terror as the ghostly travelers realized that something was catastrophically wrong with their train. Rebecca found herself frozen in place, unable to leave but horrified by what she was witnessing. The temperature in the car had dropped noticeably, and she could see her breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The voices of the passengers grew more urgent and frightened, but they still seemed to come from somewhere far away, as if she were hearing an echo of events that had occurred decades in the past. "The brakes!" shouted a man who had been standing near the front of the car. "Why aren't we slowing down? The station's right ahead." Through the car's windows, Rebecca could see the lights of Ogden Station approaching at an impossible speed. But these weren't the modern LED fixtures and safety lighting of the contemporary museum complex. They were the incandescent bulbs and oil lamps of 1952, casting their warm yellow glow across platforms that were crowded with people waiting to meet arriving passengers. The phantom passengers in the car began to scream as they realized the full scope of their peril. The sound was unlike anything Rebecca had ever heard, not just fear, but the absolute despair of people who understood they were about to die and were powerless to prevent it. The screams built upon each other, creating a chorus of terror that seemed to shake the very foundations of the museum building. Rebecca clapped her hands over her ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside her head rather than through her hearing. The temperature continued to drop, and now she could see ice crystals forming on the car's windows and fixtures. The phantom passengers were becoming more solid, more real, as if their terror was giving them substance. A young mother clutching a toddler looked directly at Rebecca for the first time, her eyes wide with desperate hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice cutting through the screams around them. "Can you help us? Can you make it stop?" Rebecca wanted to answer, wanted to somehow reach across the decades and prevent the tragedy she was witnessing, but she knew there was nothing she could do. This was an echo of events that had already happened, a recording written in the very atoms of the station that was playing itself back with supernatural intensity. The screaming reached a crescendo as the phantom train approached the station at deadly speed. Rebecca could feel the car beginning to shake and tilt as the ghostly derailment played out around her. She threw herself toward the exit door, desperate to escape the passenger car before she became caught up in the supernatural reenactment of the disaster. As she tumbled out of the car and onto the museum floor, the screaming suddenly stopped. The lights in the passenger car flickered once and then went out, leaving the exhibit in its normal darkened state. The voices, the terror, the bone-chilling cold, all of it vanished as if it had never existed. Rebecca lay on the floor for several minutes, gasping and trembling as she tried to process what she had experienced. Her radio crackled back to life, and she heard the night dispatcher calling for a routine status check. Her cell phone showed full signal strength, as if the communication blackout had never occurred. When she finally gathered the courage to look back at the passenger car, it appeared exactly as it should: empty, dark, and secured behind its protective barriers. But the door, which she distinctly remembered closing, stood slightly ajar, and the interior temperature was noticeably colder than the surrounding exhibition space. Rebecca completed her security rounds in record time, eager to finish her shift and leave the museum behind. But as she prepared her incident report, she found herself unable to write down what she had truly experienced. Who would believe such a story? Instead, she noted only that the passenger car's climate control system seemed to be malfunctioning and recommended that maintenance check it in the morning. The next day, maintenance crews found nothing wrong with the climate control system, but they did discover something unusual in the passenger car. Frost patterns had formed on several of the windows, delicate, intricate designs that looked almost like screaming faces when viewed from the right angle. The patterns couldn't be explained by any normal meteorological process, and they disappeared as soon as the heating system brought the car's temperature back to normal. Rebecca never spoke publicly about what she had witnessed that night, but she did some research into the 1952 accident. She learned that the passenger car in the museum's collection hadn't been part of the doomed train. It had been acquired from a different railroad entirely. Yet somehow, the trauma of that November night had imprinted itself on the entire station, turning every corner into a potential window into the past. In the weeks that followed, other museum staff reported strange occurrences around the passenger car exhibit. Security cameras occasionally captured inexplicable temperature drops and brief glimpses of figures moving inside the locked car. Visitors sometimes complained about hearing faint screaming sounds coming from the exhibit area, though the recorded audio systems showed no evidence of any such noises. Rebecca remained at her post for 6 more months before requesting a transfer to day shifts, citing family obligations. But on November 15th each year, the anniversary of the 1952 disaster, she made a point of visiting the museum during her off hours to leave flowers at the small memorial plaque that honored the victims. She never saw the phantom passengers again, but sometimes she felt their presence, a lingering sadness that spoke of journeys interrupted and destinations never reached. The passenger car exhibit remains one of the museum's most popular attractions, though the staff have learned to schedule maintenance checks more frequently, particularly during the colder months when the unexplained temperature fluctuations tend to be more pronounced. And on those November nights when the mountain winds howl down through Ogden Canyon and the temperature drops toward record lows, sensitive visitors sometimes report hearing what sounds like distant voices calling out in the darkness. Passengers still waiting for a train that will never arrive safely at its destination. The autumn rain hammered against the soaring windows of Baltimore Penn Station as maintenance supervisor Carl Washington made his way through the dimly lit concourses at 2:45 a.m. The station, built in 1911 and serving as a crucial hub for Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, never truly slept, but in the early morning hours it took on a different character entirely. The usual rush of business travelers and tourists gave way to a handful of homeless individuals seeking shelter, late-night workers heading home, and the occasional insomniac wandering the marble halls like a ghost in search of purpose. Carl had been working the overnight maintenance shift at Penn Station for 8 years, ever since his retirement from the Baltimore City Fire Department, and he thought he knew every sound, smell, and shadow the century-old building could produce. The station was a masterpiece of Beaux-Arts architecture, with its grand waiting room featuring a coffered ceiling that rose 60 feet above polished terrazzo floors. During the day, natural light streamed through the massive windows, creating patterns that shifted with the sun's movement. But at night, with only the security lighting to illuminate the vast spaces, the station felt like a cathedral built for midnight prayers. Tonight felt different, though. There was an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside, a sense of anticipation that made Carl's skin prickle with unease. He'd noticed it first around midnight, when the usual late evening train departures had concluded and the station had settled into its overnight rhythm. The cleaning crews had finished their work and departed, leaving him alone with the building's security staff to maintain the systems that kept this transportation hub functioning around the clock. His first stop was always the mechanical room in the basement, where he checked the heating, ventilation, and electrical systems that served the massive complex. As he descended the service stairs, his keys jangling against his utility belt, Carl became aware of a sound that seemed out of place, the distant but unmistakable voice of someone making announcements over a public address system. The voice was male, formal, and carried the distinctive cadence of railroad personnel from an earlier era. Ladies and gentlemen, the Royal Blue to New York City, with stops in Philadelphia and Newark, will be departing from Track 4 in 10 minutes. All passengers should have their tickets ready for collection. Carl paused on the stairs, listening intently. Penn Station's public address system was automated during overnight hours, programmed to announce only actual arriving and departing trains. There were no scheduled departures at this hour, and certainly no trains called the Royal Blue, which had been discontinued decades ago. Yet the announcement continued, growing more detailed and urgent. Passengers holding reservations in the first-class compartments should board at the front of the train. The dining car will be serving breakfast beginning at 6 a.m. We ask that all luggage be properly stowed and that smoking be limited to designated areas only. Carl pulled out his radio and tried to contact the security desk to inquire about the announcements, but received only static in response. The radio had been working perfectly during his earlier rounds, but now seemed completely dead despite showing full battery power. His cell phone displayed no signal bars, even though he was in an area where coverage was normally excellent. The mechanical room appeared normal when Carl reached the basement level, with all systems showing green lights and operating within normal parameters. But the temperature seemed unusually cold, dropping at least 15 degrees from the main concourse level. His breath began to mist as he checked the boiler readings, and he could see frost forming on some of the metal surfaces despite the heating system running at full capacity. The phantom announcements continued throughout his inspection, growing more frequent and detailed. They spoke of trains with names that belonged to the golden age of rail travel: the Capital Limited, the Ambassador, the Diplomat. The destinations mentioned included cities that were no longer served by passenger rail, and the departure times referenced a schedule that belonged to the 1940s and 1950s. As Carl completed his mechanical checks and prepared to return to the upper levels, he heard something that made his blood run cold: the sound of a train whistle echoing through the station's corridors. It was not the modern air horn of contemporary locomotives, but the classic steam whistle that had announced arrivals and departures in the age when rail travel was the primary means of long-distance transportation in America. The whistle was followed by the rhythmic chuffing of a steam engine and the clatter of wheels on rails, sounds that grew steadily louder as if an actual train was approaching one of the station's platforms. But Penn Station served only modern electric and diesel trains on the Northeast Corridor, and there were no steam locomotives anywhere in the region. Carl made his way toward the platform level, following the increasingly loud sounds of the phantom locomotive. As he climbed the stairs from the basement, the temperature continued to drop, and now he could see his breath in thick white clouds. The fluorescent lighting seemed dimmer than usual, as if the approaching supernatural presence was somehow absorbing the illumination. When he reached Platform 4, the source of the announcements, Carl encountered a sight that challenged everything he thought he knew about reality. The platform was fully illuminated by what appeared to be gaslight fixtures that cast dancing shadows on the walls, and it was occupied by at least 50 passengers dressed in clothing from the 1940s. Men in dark suits and fedoras checked pocket watches and consulted timetables, while women in fitted dresses and veiled hats supervised children who pressed their faces against the windows of a magnificent steam locomotive that should not have existed. The train itself was a masterpiece of mid-20th century engineering, a streamlined steam locomotive with chrome accents and an elegant paint scheme that proclaimed it as the Royal Blue Limited. Behind the engine stretched a string of passenger cars that gleamed under the gaslight, their windows glowing with warm yellow light that revealed well-appointed interiors filled with travelers. Standing beside the locomotive was a conductor in a navy blue uniform with brass buttons and a peaked cap that bore the insignia of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. He was calling out the final boarding announcement, his voice carrying the authority and precision of someone who had made thousands of such announcements during a long career in passenger service. Final call for the Royal Blue to New York City. All aboard. We'll be departing momentarily. As Carl watched, transfixed by the impossible scene, the conductor's gaze fell upon him. The man's face was weathered and kind, marked by decades of service to passengers who had trusted him to see them safely to their destinations. But there was something in his eyes that spoke of incompletion, of a duty that remained unfulfilled. "You there," the conductor called, walking toward Carl with measured steps. "Do you have a ticket for tonight's departure? We're running a bit behind schedule, but there's still time to board if you're traveling north." Carl found his voice after several attempts. "I don't. I work here. Maintenance. There aren't supposed to be any departures at this hour." The conductor looked genuinely puzzled by this response. "Work here? But this is Penn Station, son. Trains run 24 hours a day. Always have, always will. That's what keeps America moving." As the conductor spoke, Carl noticed that the man's uniform showed signs of wear that suggested decades of faithful service. The brass buttons were polished to a brilliant shine, but the fabric was faded in places where countless passenger interactions had left their mark. Most unsettling was the fact that despite the conductor's obvious solidity and presence, Carl could see through him to the train beyond, as if the man was made of morning mist given form and purpose. "What year do you think it is?" Carl asked carefully. The conductor checked his pocket watch, a railroad timepiece that gleamed with obvious pride of ownership. "November 15th, 1951. Though I have to say, this has been one of the strangest nights in my 37 years of railroad service. Usually, we have our regular passengers, the business folks heading to New York, families visiting relatives, the occasional dignitary traveling in the private cars. But tonight," he gestured toward the train with obvious confusion. "Tonight, every passenger claims they're traveling to their final destination. Not New York, not Philadelphia, but someplace they call home that they can't quite describe. And the strange thing is, I believe them. There's something in their eyes, something that tells me this really is their final journey." Carl looked more closely at the passengers boarding the Royal Blue Limited. Now that he was paying attention, he could see that they moved with a deliberate slowness that suggested people who were no longer bound by the urgency of ordinary life. Their faces held expressions of profound peace mixed with anticipation, as if they were finally embarking on a journey they had been waiting decades to take. "Who are they?" Carl whispered. The conductor followed his gaze, his expression growing thoughtful. "Passengers," he said simply. "People who were traveling through Baltimore when their time came. Some died in accidents, others passed away in their sleep in the station's hotels. A few had heart attacks right here on the platforms. But they all had tickets for somewhere else, journeys they never got to complete. So they wait, and when the conditions are right, usually on cold November nights like this one, the Royal Blue makes a special run to take them where they need to go." As if summoned by the conductor's words, more passengers began to materialize on the platform. Carl saw a young woman in a 1940s wedding dress, clutching a suitcase and looking around with obvious confusion. An elderly man in a military uniform from World War II stood at attention beside a bench, his eyes fixed on something in the distance that only he could see. Children who had been traveling alone appeared near their parents, finally reunited after decades of separation. "But you," the conductor said, turning his attention back to Carl, "you're not supposed to be here. This train is only for passengers who have already begun their final journey. You've got more time in the living world." Carl felt a strange pull toward the train, a longing that he couldn't quite explain. There was something appealing about the idea of boarding the Royal Blue Limited, of joining these peaceful passengers on their journey to whatever destination awaited them. The warm glow from the passenger car windows promised rest and escape from the responsibilities that weighed him down in his daily life. "I can see the appeal," the conductor said, reading Carl's expression with the skill of someone who had helped thousands of travelers over the years. "The journey we're offering is one way, but it's also one without worry, without pain, without the struggles that make life so difficult sometimes. But it's not your time, son. You've got people who depend on you, work that still needs doing." As the conductor spoke, Carl thought about his daughter who was struggling through her first year of college, his elderly mother who relied on him for help with her daily needs, and the coworkers who depended on his knowledge and experience to keep Penn Station running smoothly. The pull toward the train began to fade, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and obligation to the living world. "All aboard," the conductor called, moving back toward the train. "This is the final call for the Royal Blue Limited." The passengers began to board with unhurried grace, each one pausing to thank the conductor before stepping onto the train. Carl watched as the young bride found a seat by a window and pressed her hand against the glass in a gesture of farewell. The elderly soldier saluted him before disappearing into one of the passenger cars, and the children who had been waiting so long for their parents finally took their hands and climbed aboard together. As the last passenger boarded, the conductor climbed onto the train's rear platform and signaled to the engineer with a traditional lantern that cast dancing shadows on the station walls. The steam whistle blew once more, a sound so mournful and beautiful that Carl felt tears spring to his eyes without understanding why. "Take care of this place," the conductor called as the train began to move. Penn Station has always been about helping people reach their destinations, whether in this life or the next. That mission continues, even when the trains look different than they used to. The Royal Blue Limited began to pull away from the platform, gaining speed as it moved toward whatever destination awaited its passengers. The gaslight fixtures dimmed and then went out entirely, leaving Carl alone on Platform 4 with only the modern fluorescent lighting and the gradually fading sound of steam and steel. When Carl returned to the mechanical room to complete his rounds, all systems showed normal operation, and the temperature had returned to its usual comfortable level. His radio crackled back to life with a routine status check from the security desk, and his cell phone showed full signal strength. He never reported what he had witnessed that night, but word spread among the night shift staff about the maintenance supervisor who had been seen talking to empty air on Platform 4. Some dismissed it as the product of too many long nights and too much coffee, but others who had worked at Penn Station for many years nodded knowingly. They had their own stories of phantom announcements, ghostly passengers, and trains that arrived and departed according to schedules that existed only in memory. From that night forward, Carl paid special attention to Platform 4 during his rounds, not out of fear but out of respect for the conductor and his passengers who continued their eternal mission of helping souls reach their final destinations. And on cold November nights, when the wind hovered through the station's corridors and the temperature dropped unexpectedly, Carl would sometimes hear the distant sound of a train whistle calling through the darkness, followed by the gentle voice of a conductor ensuring that all passengers were safely aboard for the journey home. The wind that swept down the Hudson Valley on this bitter February night carried with it the promise of one of the worst blizzards in Albany's recorded history, and Emily Rodriguez could feel the storm's approach in her bones as she conducted her final security sweep of the beautifully restored Union Station. As the night shift supervisor for the Albany Rensselaer Transportation Authority, Emily was responsible for ensuring that the historic building remained secure and functional during the overnight hours when passenger traffic dwindled to almost nothing. The station, originally built in 1900 and serving as a testament to the grandeur of America's railroad age, had been meticulously restored to its former glory in the 1980s. Its soaring ceiling, ornate plasterwork, and magnificent stained glass windows made it one of the most beautiful transportation hubs in the Northeast, though it now served primarily as an Amtrak station with significantly reduced traffic compared to its heyday. Emily had been working nights at Union Station for 6 years, ever since her divorce had left her needing both steady employment and the solitude that came with the graveyard shift. She had grown to love the peaceful hours when the building was nearly empty, allowing her to appreciate the architectural details and craftsmanship that were often overlooked during the busy daytime hours. But tonight felt different, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. It was 1:47 a.m. when Emily first noticed the anomaly. As she conducted her routine patrol of the main waiting room, her attention was drawn to the large schedule board that displayed arrival and departure times for Amtrak services. The digital display, which should have shown only the limited overnight schedule, was instead filled with train listings that belonged to another era entirely. The board displayed departures for trains with names like the Empire State Express, the 20th Century Limited, and the Water Level Route, legendary trains that had ceased operation decades ago. The destinations included cities that were no longer served by passenger rail, and the departure times suggested a frequency of service that belonged to the golden age of rail travel in the 1940s and 1950s. Emily approached the schedule board for a closer look, noting that the display seemed to flicker between the correct modern schedule and this impossible historical timetable. As she watched, new entries appeared on the board, including one that made her blood run cold. Special service, the Governor's Express, departure 2:15 a.m., Platform 1, final destination. The phrase final destination sent a chill through Emily that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature outside. In her 6 years at the station, she had never seen such a listing, and the formal, ominous tone suggested something far more significant than a routine train departure. Her radio crackled with static as she tried to contact the Central Dispatch office to inquire about the mysterious schedule changes, but she received only interference in response. The communication system had been working perfectly during her earlier rounds, but now seemed completely disconnected from the outside world. As Emily stood before the flickering schedule board, she became aware of voices coming from the direction of Platform 1. The conversation was distant but carried the formal cadence of official business, punctuated by the sound of footsteps echoing on the platform's concrete surface. This was highly unusual, as no trains were scheduled to arrive or depart at this hour, and Platform 1 should have been completely empty. Making her way toward the platform area, Emily noticed that the temperature was dropping rapidly throughout the station. Her breath began to mist, and frost was forming on the metal surfaces of the railings and benches. The heating system indicator lights showed normal operation, but the building felt as cold as if all heating had been shut off for hours. Platform 1 stretched before her in the dim emergency lighting, but as Emily approached, she could see a warmer glow emanating from the far end where an impossible sight awaited her. A magnificent steam locomotive sat at the platform, its brass fittings gleaming in the light cast by what appeared to be gas lamps that lined the track area. Behind the engine stretched a train of passenger cars that belonged to the finest era of American railroad luxury: observation cars with curved glass windows, dining cars with ornate exteriors, and sleeping cars that spoke of journeys undertaken by the wealthy and powerful. The locomotive itself was a masterpiece of engineering from the 1940s, painted in a deep blue and silver scheme with gold lettering that proclaimed it as the Governor's Express. Steam rose from various points on the engine, creating ghostly wisps that danced in the cold air, and the soft chuffing of the boiler created a rhythm that seemed to match Emily's rapidly beating heart. Standing beside the train was a conductor in an impeccable uniform that bore the insignia of the New York Central Railroad. His face was dignified and serious, marked by the kind of responsibility that comes from serving the most important passengers of his era. But there was something in his expression that suggested this was no ordinary departure, no routine service call. As Emily approached, the conductor noticed her presence and walked forward with measured steps. "Good evening, miss. I'm Conductor Morrison of the Governor's Express. Are you here to see off our distinguished passenger?" Emily found her voice after several attempts. "I'm security for the station. There aren't supposed to be any trains here at this hour, and I need to see some authorization for this service." Conductor Morrison's expression grew puzzled, as if her question didn't make sense in the context of his reality. "Authorization? Miss, this is a special service authorized at the highest levels of state government. Governor Dewey himself arranged for this departure." The mention of Governor Dewey, Thomas E. Dewey, who had served as New York's governor from 1943 to 1954, sent another chill through Emily. She was looking at something that belonged to the distant past, yet felt impossibly real and immediate. "What year do you think it is?" Emily asked carefully. Morrison checked his pocket watch, a railroad timepiece that gleamed with obvious care and pride. "March 16th, 1953. And I must say, this has been one of the most unusual assignments of my career. 31 years with the Central, and I've never been asked to prepare a train for this kind of journey." As Emily processed this information, she became aware of activity inside the passenger cars. Through the windows, she could see figures moving about, men in dark suits consulting documents, women in formal attire preparing for what appeared to be a significant journey. But there was something ethereal about their movements, as if she were watching shadows performing the rituals of travel rather than actual passengers. "Who's traveling tonight?" Emily asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. Morrison's expression grew even more solemn. "Governor Roosevelt, Miss Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Though I have to say he's not looking well. Not well at all. The doctors say the train ride might help, getting him away from the pressures of Albany and Washington. But between you and me, I think this might be his final journey." The impossibility of the situation crashed over Emily like a wave. Franklin Roosevelt had died in 1945, not 1953, and he had been president, not governor of New York. Yet Morrison spoke with such conviction, such genuine concern for his distinguished passenger, that Emily found herself accepting the supernatural nature of what she was witnessing. May I see him?" Emily asked, driven by a curiosity that overrode her fear. Morrison considered her request with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to protecting important passengers from unnecessary disturbances. "I suppose it would be all right," he said finally. "He's in the observation car, spending what might be his last few minutes in New York. He always loved this state, called it his true home, even when duty took him to Washington." Emily followed Morrison to the rear of the train, where the observation car's curved windows glowed with warm light. As they climbed the steps onto the car's platform, she could feel the weight of history surrounding her, as if she were stepping into a moment that had been preserved in time like an insect in amber. The interior of the observation car was magnificently appointed, with rich wood paneling, plush seating, and brass fixtures that reflected the warm light from ornate lamps. At the far end of the car, silhouetted against the large curved window that offered a view of the Albany skyline, sat a figure that Emily immediately recognized from countless photographs and newsreels. Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat in his wheelchair, wrapped in a heavy coat and blanket, gazing out at the city lights with an expression of profound melancholy. His famous profile was unmistakable, but Emily was struck by how frail he appeared, how the weight of leadership had carved deep lines in his face and bowed his shoulders with invisible burdens. As if sensing their presence, Roosevelt turned his head toward them, and Emily found herself looking into eyes that held the depth of someone who had guided a nation through its darkest hours. When he spoke, his voice carried the familiar cadence of his radio addresses, but with a weariness that spoke of battles fought and sacrifices made. "Ah, Conductor Morrison, and who is this young lady?" Another well-wisher come to see the old politician off on his final journey. Emily felt compelled to step forward, though she wasn't sure what protocol applied to meeting the ghost of a deceased president. "Mr. President, I'm Emily Rodriguez. I work security here at the station." Roosevelt's eyes twinkled with gentle humor despite his obvious fatigue. "Security, you say? Well, I suppose even ghosts need proper oversight. Tell me, Miss Rodriguez, what year is it in your world?" The question caught Emily off guard, but she realized that Roosevelt was somehow aware of the supernatural nature of their encounter. 2025, Mr. President." Roosevelt nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. 80 years, he mused. "I've been riding this train for 80 years, visiting the places and people I loved most, trying to ensure that the work we started continued even after I was gone. But I think it's finally time to reach my final destination." As Roosevelt spoke, Emily became aware that other passengers were materializing throughout the observation car. She recognized some faces from history books: Eleanor Roosevelt, taking a seat beside her husband with the grace and dignity that had made her one of the most beloved first ladies in American history. Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's closest advisor, looking pale and worn but maintaining the alert expression of someone still deeply engaged in matters of state. "We've all been riding the Governor's Express," Eleanor Roosevelt explained, her voice carrying the warm strength that had comforted millions during the Depression and World War II. "All of us who gave our lives to public service, who died with work still unfinished, causes still unfought. We've been traveling through time, watching over the democracy we helped to preserve, making sure that the flame of freedom continued to burn bright." Harry Hopkins leaned forward, his eyes intense with the passion that had driven his tireless work on behalf of the New Deal programs. "We've seen the country face new challenges, new threats to the principles we held dear. Sometimes we've been able to offer guidance, whisper suggestions to leaders who needed to hear the lessons of history. But our time as guardians is coming to an end. The train has been taking us to moments when our guidance was most needed," Roosevelt added, his gaze returning to the window and the city beyond. "Albany holds special significance for me. It's where I learned the craft of governance, where I first understood that public service was about more than personal ambition. It's fitting that our final departure should be from here." Emily felt tears forming in her eyes as she understood what she was witnessing. This wasn't just a supernatural encounter, it was a farewell, a final gathering of public servants who had dedicated their lives to the American experiment in democracy and were now preparing to release their guardianship to the next generation. "What can I do?" Emily asked, though she wasn't sure what she was offering. Roosevelt smiled, and for a moment, Emily could see the charm and confidence that had inspired a nation during its darkest hours. "Remember us," he said simply. "Remember that democracy is not a spectator sport, that each generation must earn anew the freedoms that previous generations fought to preserve. The train will continue to run, Miss Rodriguez, but it will carry new passengers, men and women who will face challenges we could never have imagined." As if summoned by Roosevelt's words, the train's whistle blew, not the harsh air horn of modern locomotives, but the melodious call of the great steam engines that had once carried America's leaders across a rapidly changing continent. Morrison appeared at Emily's elbow, his expression respectful but urgent. "All aboard, Mr. President. It's time for our final departure." Roosevelt nodded and wheeled himself toward the front of the car, followed by Eleanor and the other passengers who had shared his long journey through time. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor Roosevelt paused beside Emily and pressed something into her hand, a small pin bearing the presidential seal. "A reminder," Eleanor said softly, "that the work of democracy is never finished, and each of us has a role to play in keeping the light of freedom burning bright." Emily watched from the platform as the Governor's Express began to move, slowly at first and then with increasing speed. Through the windows, she could see Roosevelt and his companions settling in for their final journey, their faces peaceful and satisfied with work well done. The train's whistle blew one last time, a sound so beautiful and mournful that it seemed to contain all the hopes and struggles of the American experience. As the last car disappeared into the darkness, Emily found herself alone on the platform with only the pin in her hand as evidence of what she had witnessed. The gas lamps faded, replaced by the harsh fluorescent lighting of the modern station, and the temperature began to return to normal as the heating system reasserted itself. When Emily returned to the main waiting room, the schedule board displayed only the correct modern timetable, with no trace of the Governor's Express or its impossible departure time. Her radio crackled back to life with a routine status check from the Central Dispatch Office, and her cell phone showed full signal strength. She never filed an official report about what she had witnessed that night, but she kept Eleanor Roosevelt's pin as a reminder of the encounter and the responsibility it represented. In the months that followed, Emily found herself becoming more involved in her community, volunteering for voter registration drives and civic education programs, feeling called to continue the work of democracy that Roosevelt and his companions had begun so many decades ago. Other night shift workers at Union Station began to report strange occurrences around Platform 1, the sound of steam engines in the distance, glimpses of figures in vintage clothing, and the occasional warm glow that seemed to emanate from empty track areas. But these sightings became less frequent over time, as if the Governor's Express had indeed completed its final journey and passed its guardianship on to the living. And sometimes, when the wind blew down from the Hudson Valley on cold February nights, Emily would hear the distant sound of a train whistle calling through the darkness, not mournful but triumphant, like a signal that the work of democracy continued and that new guardians had taken up the eternal watch over America's promise of freedom and justice for all. The marble floors of Washington Union Station gleamed under the soft lighting that illuminated the concourse at 2:17 a.m., reflecting the classical architecture that had made this transportation hub one of the most beautiful in America since its completion in 1907. Detective Sarah Williams of the Metropolitan Police Department's 3rd District had been called to investigate reports of suspicious activity in the station's lower levels, though the security supervisor who had made the call had been frustratingly vague about what exactly had been observed. Sarah had been a DC cop for 15 years, working her way up from patrol officer to detective, and she had seen every kind of crime and oddity that the nation's capital had to offer. Political scandals, international espionage, protests that turned violent, and the occasional genuine mystery that defied easy explanation. Union Station, with its mix of commuters, tourists, and the occasional homeless population seeking shelter, generated its share of calls, but most were routine matters that could be handled by patrol officers. This call had been different, though. The security supervisor, a man named Rodriguez who had worked at the station for over a decade, had specifically requested a detective, claiming that what his officers had witnessed couldn't be adequately explained in a standard incident report. When pressed for details over the phone, Rodriguez had only said that there were people where people shouldn't be, and that the situation required someone with experience in unusual circumstances. Sarah found Rodriguez waiting for her near the information desk in the main hall, his normally composed demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. He was a former Metro Transit police officer who had seen his share of strange incidents over the years, so his visible distress immediately put Sarah on alert. "Detective Williams? Thank you for coming so quickly," Rodriguez said, extending his hand. "I know this sounds crazy, but we've got a situation in the lower level that I've never encountered in 23 years of security work." "Tell me what you observed," Sarah replied, pulling out her notebook. "Start from the beginning." Rodriguez led her toward the escalators that descended to the station's lower levels, where Amtrak passengers waited for long-distance trains and the food court served late-night travelers. As they walked, he explained that the incident had begun around 1:30 a.m., when one of his patrol officers had reported seeing lights and hearing voices in a section of the station that had been closed to the public since the 1990s. "It's the old Platform A," Rodriguez explained, "used to serve some of the long-distance routes before they reconfigured the track layout. Now it's just used for storage and maintenance access. Nobody should be down there, especially not at this hour." They descended to the lower level, where the normal bustle of daytime activity had given way to the sparse late-night crowd of travelers waiting for early morning departures. The area felt different at this hour, larger somehow, with shadows that seemed deeper and sounds that echoed strangely off the tiled walls and concrete pillars. Rodriguez led Sarah past the active platforms toward a corridor marked "Authorized Personnel Only." As they approached the restricted area, Sarah could see what had alarmed the security team. There was indeed light coming from beyond the locked gate that blocked access to the abandoned platform, not the harsh fluorescent lighting of the station's operational areas, but a softer, warmer glow that seemed to flicker like gaslight or candles. "That gate has been locked for 30 years, Rodriguez said, checking his key ring. "And there's no power supply to that section. The electrical service was disconnected during the renovation." As they stood before the gate, Sarah became aware of voices coming from the other side. Multiple conversations in what sounded like formal, old-fashioned speech patterns. The voices were too distant and muffled to make out specific words, but the cadence and tone suggested people engaged in serious, official business. "How many of your officers have seen this?" Sarah asked, taking photos of the gate and the light beyond. "3 so far. My patrol supervisor, Officer Chun, was the first to notice it. Then Officers Murphy and Washington both confirmed the sighting during their rounds. But here's the thing that really bothers me. Our security cameras show nothing unusual. The monitors display the area as completely dark and empty." Sarah examined the lock on the gate more closely. It showed no signs of tampering, and the heavy chain that secured it was covered in dust that appeared undisturbed. Yet the light and voices continued to emanate from the supposedly empty platform beyond. "I need to get in there," Sarah said. "Do you have a key?" Rodriguez nodded reluctantly. "I do. But Detective, I have to tell you something else. This isn't the first time we've had reports about Platform A. Over the years, there have been incidents. Nothing we could ever document officially, but staff members have reported strange things. Voices, lights, and sometimes people in old-fashioned clothing who disappear when approached." As Rodriguez unlocked the gate, Sarah felt a distinct change in the air pressure, as if they were entering a space that existed under different atmospheric conditions. The temperature dropped noticeably, and she could see her breath beginning to mist in the suddenly cold air. The corridor beyond the gate stretched into darkness, with the mysterious light source still not visible around the bend that led to the actual platform area. As they walked deeper into the abandoned section, Sarah noted that the architecture here was subtly different from the rest of the station, more ornate, with decorative elements that spoke of an earlier era of railroad construction. When they finally rounded the corner and saw Platform A itself, Sarah had to grip Rodriguez's arm to steady herself. The platform was fully illuminated and occupied by at least 30 people in clothing that belonged to the 1940s and early 1950s. Men in dark suits and overcoats stood in small groups, speaking in low, urgent voices, while women in conservative dresses and hats sat on benches with travel cases beside them. But what truly unsettled Sarah was the sense of purpose and gravity that emanated from the assembled figures. These weren't casual travelers waiting for a train. They carried themselves with the bearing of people involved in matters of national importance. Several of the men wore military uniforms from World War II and the Korean War era, while others had the look of government officials or diplomats. "Can you see them?" Rodriguez whispered, his voice trembling. "I see them," Sarah confirmed, though she could hardly believe her own words. "Who are they?" Before Rodriguez could answer, one of the figures on the platform turned toward them. It was a tall man in a Navy uniform with the insignia of a high-ranking officer. His face was gaunt and serious, marked by the kind of stress that comes from bearing terrible secrets. "You're not supposed to be here," the officer said, his voice carrying clearly across the platform despite the distance. "This is a classified briefing. Unauthorized personnel must clear the area immediately." Sarah instinctively reached for her badge, then realized how absurd the gesture was. "I'm Detective Williams, Metropolitan Police. Can you identify yourself?" The officer approached them with measured steps, and as he drew closer, Sarah could see that his uniform bore campaign ribbons from both World Wars, along with decorations she didn't recognize. His eyes held the hollow look of someone who had seen too much combat and carried too many burdens. "Captain James Morrison, Military Intelligence," he replied. Though I suppose rank doesn't matter much now, does it? We've been waiting here for 70 years, detective. Waiting for someone to finally acknowledge what happened on this platform. Rodriguez grabbed Sarah's arm. Detective, we need to leave. Now. But Sarah found herself drawn into the mystery, her investigative instincts overriding her fear. What happened here, Captain? What are you waiting for? Captain Morrison's expression grew even more grave. Operation Ghost Train, he said. December 1952. We were briefing a select group of officials about certain discoveries that had been made during the war. Technologies and information that were deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. The meeting was held here, in secret, using Platform A as a secure location. As Morrison spoke, other figures on the platform began to turn their attention to Sarah and Rodriguez. She could see faces marked by the same haunted expression: government officials, military officers, scientists, and others who clearly belonged to the highest levels of the national security apparatus during the early Cold War period. But something went wrong, Morrison continued. The meeting was compromised. Foreign agents had learned about Operation Ghost Train, and well, let's just say that none of us left this platform alive that night. The temperature around them dropped even further, and Sarah could now see her breath in thick white clouds. The lighting on the platform began to flicker, and the assembled figures became more translucent, as if the effort of maintaining their manifestation was draining them. They covered it up, of course, Morrison said, his voice becoming fainter. Officially, there was no meeting, no Operation Ghost Train, no deaths on Platform A. The families were told we died in training accidents or classified missions overseas. But we've been trapped here ever since, bound to this place by the secrets we were sworn to protect. Sarah felt a journalist's instinct warring with her duty as a police officer. This was potentially one of the biggest stories in American history, a government cover-up involving the deaths of high-ranking officials and the suppression of dangerous wartime discoveries. But it was also clearly a supernatural encounter that would destroy her credibility if she tried to report it officially. What kind of discoveries? Sarah asked. What was so dangerous that it had to be hidden? Morrison's form began to fade more rapidly. Things we found in Germany and Japan after the war. Technologies that shouldn't exist, knowledge that came from elsewhere. We were the guardians of secrets that could have changed the world or destroyed it. And now we're the guardians of our own secret, trapped between life and death until someone finally tells our story. The other figures on the platform were becoming increasingly transparent, their voices joining Morrison's in a chorus of whispered pleas. Tell them what happened. Tell them we served our country to the very end. Don't let us be forgotten. As the ghostly assembly began to fade entirely, Sarah heard Morrison speak one last time. The files still exist, detective, hidden in the National Archives under a classification level that officially doesn't exist. Look for Project Nightfall. Look for the Ghost Train manifests. The truth is there for someone brave enough to find it. With that, the platform returned to darkness, leaving Sarah and Rodriguez alone in the abandoned space with only the echo of their own breathing and the distant sound of a train whistle that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They made their way back to the operational areas of the station in silence, both struggling to process what they had witnessed. Rodriguez locked the gate behind them, but Sarah noticed that the chain felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from the metal links. Sarah spent the remainder of her shift writing an incident report that documented unexplained lighting and acoustic anomalies in the abandoned platform area, recommending a full maintenance inspection and suggesting that the space be monitored more closely for unauthorized access. She made no mention of the ghostly assembly or Captain Morrison's revelations, knowing that such claims would end her career. But in the days that followed, Sarah found herself researching Project Nightfall and Operation Ghost Train in her spare time. Most searches turned up nothing, but occasionally she would find fragments, references in declassified documents, obituaries of military officers who had died in training accidents in December 1952, and tantalizing hints of classified research programs that had been abruptly terminated in the early 1950s. 3 months later, Sarah received an unexpected call from a historian at the National Security Agency who was researching Cold War intelligence operations. During their conversation, he mentioned finding references to a series of high-level security briefings that had been held at non-traditional venues in Washington during 1952, including at least one meeting that had ended in tragedy when foreign agents had infiltrated the location. The whole thing was hushed up, the historian explained. But there are hints in the archived files that several important officials died during what was classified as a security incident at an undisclosed location. The families were never told the truth about how their loved ones had died. Sarah never returned to Platform A, but other officers who worked the late shift at Union Station began to report similar sightings, glimpses of people in vintage clothing, voices speaking in hushed tones about classified matters, and the persistent feeling that the abandoned platform was watching and waiting for someone to finally reveal its secrets. And sometimes, on December nights when the temperature dropped and the station was nearly empty, security cameras would malfunction just long enough for the ghosts of Operation Ghost Train to hold their eternal briefing, still protecting secrets that the living world might never be ready to learn. As we close the doors on these 5 haunting encounters from America's most storied train stations, remember that the rails that once connected our nation carried more than just passengers and cargo. They transported dreams, secrets, and sometimes the very souls of those who served them faithfully unto death. These platforms may be silent now, but their memories echo through time, waiting in the shadows for the next midnight traveler to witness their eternal stories. The highways of America hold their own collection of dark tales, where the lonely stretches of asphalt become theaters for encounters that defy explanation. Join us next time as we venture onto the open road with truckers who've seen things that will make you think twice about that late-night drive. From phantom hitchhikers to ghostly rest stops that shouldn't exist, our next journey takes us deep into 10 creepy trucker tales from America's highways, stories that will ride with you long after the engine stops running.